Note. You'll find the Battle of Chattanooga map on page 310. Having retired to Chattanooga after the Battle of Chickamauga, the Union Army formed a line in front of the town from the river above to the river below. The troops occupied as salients the strong unfinished works left by the Confederates, which they connected by rifle pits. Within 2 days the position was made practically impregnable. In the meantime the Confederates had advanced from Chickamauga and taken up position in front of the Federals. Their line began on the right at a point near the railway tunnel east of the town, ran along the western side of the Missionary Ridge to a point about 2 miles south of Orchard Knob, then turned westward across the valley to Lookout Mountain. At Chattanooga, the course of the Tennessee River is due west. After passing the town it flows south to the foot of Lookout Mountain, and then makes a great bend to the north, enclosing a peninsula some 3 miles in length by less than a mile in width, known as Moccasin Point. Crossing the river at the town, a road leads southwest across this point to Brown's Ferry, and thence continues in a southerly direction along a deep gorge between a narrow range of hills, close by the water's edge and the base of Raccoon Mountain until, as it enters Lookout Valley, it curves westward and passes over a depression in the mountain to Kelly's Ferry. The railroad from Chattanooga to Bridgeport runs along the south side of the river, passes close under the point of Lookout Mountain, and crosses Raccoon Mountain by this same depression, as does also the wagon road from Wauhatchie in the valley to Bridgeport. At the extreme northern angle of the bend in the river, the water rushes through the mountains with such velocity that steamers in high water cannot stem the current. This necessitated the landing of supplies at Kelly's Ferry, and then hauling them overland across the bridge at Brown's Ferry to Chattanooga. On retiring to Chattanooga, Rosecrans withdrew a small force which had been stationed on the point of Lookout Mountain, as he did not think it practicable to keep up communication between his force and his army in the town. Bragg immediately occupied the mountain, and placed batteries commanding the railroad and the river. He also sent Longstreet's corps into Lookout Valley, and the Confederate sharpshooters stationed along the river prevented the use of the wagon road to Bridgeport. From water to water the Union army was invested in a semicircle. The only route by which supplies could come, was a narrow and winding wagon road from Bridgeport through Jasper and over Walden Ridge, a distance of 60 miles. Bragg sent Wheeler's cavalry to cut this line also, and sat down to await the starvation of the Union army. Longstreet, indeed, advocated the bolder course of crossing the river above Chattanooga, so as to cut off Rosecrans' line of retreat and compel him to come out and fight at a disadvantage, but Bragg felt that he would make sure of his prey by simply waiting. Rosecrans had placed his cavalry on the northern side of the river to protect his trains; but they were eluded by Wheeler, who struck the line at Anderson's Cross Roads on the Sequatchie Valley, where he burned 300 wagons and captured 1,800 mules. He was closely pursued, however, by the Federal cavalry, and finally driven across the Tennessee into Alabama, in a very shattered condition. Then, early in October, heavy rains set in, and proved a worse foe than the Confederate troopers. The roads became almost impassable. The remaining mules were pressed beyond endurance. Each successive trip from Bridgeport was made with fewer wagons and lighter loads. The artillery horses died by the score from starvation, and finally it was impossible to move the guns for lack of animals. It began to look as if the Union army would be starved into surrender, or forced to retreat with great peril, and certainly loss of all materiel. But the government at Washington had become thoroughly aroused concerning the dangerous situation of the army at Chattanooga, and prompt measures were taken for its relief. Hooker was sent west with the 11th and 12th Corps, under Howard and Slocum, from the Army of the Potomac; and General Grant, at Vicksburg, was ordered to dispatch large reinforcements to Rosecrans. Grant himself was directed to go to Louisville, and was met en route at Indianapolis on the 17th of October by Mr. Stanton. The Secretary handed him 2 orders, identical in all but one particular, and told him that he might take his choice. Both gave him the command of all the territory between the Alleghanies and the Mississippi River, but one left the department commanders as they were, while the other assigned Thomas to the command of the Army of the Cumberland in place of Rosecrans. Grant accepted the latter, and a copy was telegraphed to Rosecrans. While Grant and Stanton were at Louisville, a telegram was received from Charles A. Dana, a representative of the War Department, then at Chattanooga, saying that Rosecrans was preparing to retreat. This information was incorrect, but Grant telegraphed Thomas, now in command, that he "must hold Chattanooga at all hazards," and that brave soldier replied, "We will hold the town till we starve." Meanwhile, there had been several important changes in the organizations of the two hostile armies. McCook and Crittenden had been relieved, and ordered before a court of inquiry for their conduct at the battle of Chickamauga; and their two corps, the 20th and 21st, had been consolidated into a single corps, numbered the 4th, which was placed under the command of Gordon Granger. In the Confederate army, Polk had been relieved, under charges for failure to open the battle of the 20th of September at daybreak. Hill and Buckner were gone, but Hardee had returned. The army was now organized in three corps, under Longstreet, Hardee, and Breckinridge. The right of the Confederate line was held by Hardee, the center by Breckinridge, and left by Longstreet, whose line extended from Chattanooga Creek to Mountain Lookout. Although the outposts of the two armies were so close together that the sentinels could "swap yarns and tobacco," there was practically no fighting. Occasionally, the Confederates threw a few shells into the town, but they did no harm. On the 3rd of October, Hooker arrived at Stevenson. On the 21st, after dark, Grant reached the same place on his way to Chattanooga. Rosecrans, who was there on his way north, saw Grant, and they had a "brief interview," in which he, Rosecrans, described very clearly the situation at Chattanooga, and made some excellent suggestions as to what should be done. Grant adds, very sarcastically, "My only wonder was that he had not carried them out." This slur was absolutely uncalled for, as Grant, when he reached Chattanooga 2 days later, had nothing to do beyond approving the plan proposed by General Smith for reopening the line of communications to Bridgeport, which Rosecrans had accepted, and Thomas was arranging to carry out. It is necessary to make this point clear, because some writers have shown a disposition to give all the credit to Grant. There was universal regret among the troops when they learned that Rosecrans had been relieved. Every soldier in the army felt that he had a friend in "Old Rosy." Although Rosecrans was frequently irascible with his superiors, to his subordinates he was one of the most genial of men. He was one of the finest strategists of the Civil War, and the Union cause suffered a great loss when he went to join so many other able generals in retirement. On the 24th of October, the morning after his arrival, General Grant ordered pushed to completion the admirable plan conceived by the chief engineer of the Army of the Cumberland, General William F. Smith, familiarly known to the soldiers as "Baldy" Smith. This plan was to throw a pontoon bridge across the river at Brown's Ferry; get control of the country south of the Tennessee and west of Lookout Mountain; then reopen the line of communications by a wagon road to Kelly's Ferry, and by boat from there to Bridgeport. As Hooker's troops were not required in Chattanooga, they had been kept near Bridgeport since their arrival on the 3rd of October, until arrangements could be made for their cooperation. Hooker was now ordered to cross the river with the 11th Corps and one division of the 12th, and march up via Wauhatchie to Brown's Ferry. Palmer, with a division of the 14th Corps, was ordered to move down the river on the north side by a back road, until opposite Whitesides, then cross and hold the road in Hooker's rear after he had passed. At the same time, 4,000 men were detailed to act directly under Smith from Chattanooga. 1,800 of these troops, under General Hazen, were to float down the river in pontoon boats to Brown's Ferry, under cover of night, land on the south side, and capture or drive away the enemy's pickets. Smith was to march with the remainder of his force also by night, by the north bank to Brown's Ferry, taking with him all the material for laying the bridge as soon as the crossing was secured. This project was carried out exactly as planned. The Confederate pickets were driven off up the valley; the bridge was promptly laid, the position entrenched, and held until the arrival of Hooker's troops the next day. Hooker marched into Lookout Valley by the road along the base of Raccoon Mountain. Howard's corps, which was in the lead, met a part of Law's brigade, which was supporting the Confederate sharpshooters along the river, and drove it up the valley. This detachment in its retreat destroyed the railway bridge over Lookout Creek. Geary's division was left at Wauhatchie to guard the road to Kelly's Ferry, and at 6 o'clock Howard halted for the night within 2 miles of Brown's Ferry. Bragg at first could not credit the report of his signal officers, but hurried to Lookout Mountain with Longstreet, and from the summit watched the Federal column marching quietly along the valley toward Brown's Ferry. Longstreet continues: "Presently the rear guard came in sight and made a bivouac immediately in front of the point where we stood." This was Geary's division at Wauhatchie. It was arranged to make a night attack upon Geary with 4 brigades, but the Confederates were repulsed, with heavy casualties on both sides. General Alexander terms this night attack "one of the most foolhardy adventures of the war." No further attempts were made by Bragg to molest the "cracker line," as the soldiers called it, and the supply problem was solved. The siege of Chattanooga was raised, and the reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac made Grant's strength equal to that of Bragg. A Richmond paper said: "The admirably conceived and perfectly executed coup at Brown's Ferry has robbed the Confederacy of all its dearly earned advantages gained at Chickamauga." It seems almost inconceivable that Bragg should have chosen this moment to weaken his forces by sending Longstreet, his ablest corps commander, with 1/3 of his army, to attack Burnside at Knoxville. He apparently underrated the energy of his opponent, and thought that Longstreet should chase Burnside out of East Tennessee, and return before Grant was ready to assume the offensive. Bragg has been very severely criticized for his action. "It ought to have been clear to him," says Professor Fiske, "that if he won the battle, Knoxville would be at his mercy, while if he lost it, Knoxville would be relieved." But Bragg was no fool. He knew the deplorable condition of the Army of the Cumberland at this time. When Grant suggested to Thomas an assault on Missionary Ridge, in the hope of causing Bragg to recall Longstreet, Thomas reminded him that the artillery horses were all dead, and the cannon could not be moved. Immediately after the defeat at Chickamauga, Halleck had ordered Sherman to start for Chattanooga. Sherman accordingly left Vicksburg on the 27th of September, with his command in steamboats, and reached Memphis, 400 miles up the river, 5 days later. With his usual fatuity, Halleck had directed Sherman to repair the railroad as he advanced toward Chattanooga. Thus hampered, it was nearly a month before Sherman could reach Iuka, still 200 miles distant from Chattanooga. As soon as Grant arrived at Chattanooga, he telegraphed Sherman to "drop everything," and hurry to Stevenson with his entire force. The result was, that Sherman got his army up to Stevenson and Bridgeport by the 14th of November, and the following day reported in person to Grant at Chattanooga. With his arrival, and the army again well supplied with everything necessary, Grant was at last ready to strike. His plan of battle was as follows: Sherman with his 4 divisions was to cross to the north bank at Brown's Ferry, march east behind the hills, out of view of the Confederates, and take a position under cover of the woods opposite the mouth of Chickamauga Creek. Here he was to recross the river by a pontoon bridge, and seize the north end of Missionary Ridge before the enemy could occupy it in force. As soon as he was astride the ridge at the tunnel, Thomas was to move the Army of the Cumberland to the left and connect with Sherman. Then their united forces were to move southward, driving the Confederates up the valley of Chattanooga Creek and away from their base of supplies at Chickamauga Station. Howard's corps was to be in reserve on the north bank, ready to aid Sherman or Thomas, as circumstances might require. Hooker, with Cruft's division of Granger's corps, sent him from Chattanooga, was to hold Lookout Valley. This plan, as will appear later, was modified in its execution. Sherman's movement was much delayed by heavy rains which raised the river, and he did not cross east of the town until the morning of the 24th of November. Even then, a break in the bridge at Brown's Ferry prevented Osterhaus's division from joining him, and it was ordered to report to Hooker. Bragg was completely deceived by Sherman's movements, and thought that he was going to the relief of Burnside at Knoxville. He therefore, on the very eve of the battle, dispatched 2 more divisions to reinforce Longstreet, and was able to get only one of them back, in time to be of service. On the 20th, Bragg sent Grant a most extraordinary letter, which is not easy to understand. "As there may be still some non combatants in Chattanooga," he wrote, "I deem it proper to notify you that prudence would dictate their early withdrawal." This may have been intended to deter Grant from detaching any more troops to aid Burnside, but Grant was more inclined to regard it as a ruse to prevent him from attacking before the enemy had time to withdraw. Accordingly, on the afternoon of the 23d, he ordered Thomas to make a demonstration in force. His line, in the center, facing Missionary Ridge, was made up of the corps of Granger and Palmer, of the Army of the Cumberland, and Howard's corps of the Army of the Potomac, about 30,000 men in all. After advancing a short distance with such deliberation that the enemy thought they were on parade, these troops made a sudden rush and captured Orchard Knob, a prominent knoll about a mile in front of the western base of Missionary Ridge. The results of this demonstration were threefold. It was developed that Bragg's army was present in force, and meant to stay; it gained an excellent position when strengthened by artillery, from which to make the final assault 2 days later; and it caused Bragg to weaken his left on Lookout Mountain, by transferring Walker's strong division to his right. This division took position on Missionary Ridge, half a mile south of the tunnel, and was the first Confederate detachment to occupy the crest. This withdrawal greatly lightened Hooker's task of assaulting and carrying Lookout the following day. Grant's original plan was only for Hooker to hold Lookout Valley and guard the line of communications with Bridgeport. But the addition of Osterhaus's division gave him a force of some 10,000 men, and Grant thought that he was strong enough to do more. Hooker was therefore ordered to try to take the point of Lookout Mountain. This position was almost impregnable by nature, but since the withdrawal of Walker's division it was held only by 3 weak brigades: one on the slope where Hooker made his assault, and 2 at the summit, about 1,700 men in all. The side of Lookout Mountain rises from the valley below in a natural slope, covered with a scrubby growth of wood, and of boulders of all sizes which have fallen from the cliffs. Beyond this slope, a precipice of solid, bare, jagged rock rises several hundred feet straight to the plateau of the mountain, 1,400 feet above the waters of the Tennessee. At the northern end of the mountain, however, beyond the foot of the precipice, was the Craven Farm, a comparatively smooth piece of land under cultivation. Between the farm and the base of the Palisades there were wooded and rocky slopes; as also on the river side, where they ended in another cliff which dropped straight to the railway track at the water's edge. The narrow road from Chattanooga to Lookout Valley passes over the nose of the mountain just above this cliff. Another road from the town ran up the eastern face of the mountain to Summertown on the plateau. The military road, winding up the north face of Lookout, was built by Hooker after the battle. The Summertown road was then the only way by which troops on the plateau could reach the slopes of the mountains or the valley below. The Confederates had entrenchments at the Craven Farm; also near the base of the western slope, covering the railway and wagon bridges over Lookout Creek, and down the northern slope, so arranged as to meet attacks from either Lookout or Chattanooga valleys. On the morning of the 24th of November, there was a mist over the mountain, which later settled down into a dense fog. At 8 o'clock, Geary's division of the 12th Corps crossed Lookout Creek from Wauhatchie. It was joined on the left in the valley by Osterhaus's division of the 15th Corps and Cruft's division of the 4th Corps. These troops, supported by artillery placed in commanding positions on the left bank of the creek, drove the enemy out of his entrenchments at the bridges, and crossed near that point. Aided by the fire of batteries on Moccasin Point, the Union forces pushed up the rocky slope, driving the Confederates from one position after another. By noon, Hooker had possession of the Craven Farm. Here the Confederate brigade which had defended the slope was joined by the 2 brigades from the plateau, and a stand was made about 400 yards beyond the Craven house. This line was held until midnight, when the Confederates withdrew from the mountain. On account of the fog and the exhaustion of his ammunition, Hooker halted his line and entrenched. Late in the afternoon, a supply of ammunition was brought from Chattanooga by Carlin's brigade, which took post on the right of the line. Early the next morning, the 25th, some men from the 8th Kentucky scaled the heights and hoisted the stars and stripes on the summit, where at sunrise the flag floated in full view of the Union and Confederate troops in the lines below. While the battle above the clouds was taking place, Sherman, at the other end of the line, was endeavoring to carry out his part of the programme. His pontoons had been concealed in North Chickamauga Creek, which enters the Tennessee on the north side 2 miles above the mouth of the Chickamauga on the opposite side. During the night of the 23d, these were quietly floated down the stream, and by daybreak 8,000 men had crossed. Little opposition was encountered, and the troops immediately threw up a bridgehead. As soon as the bridge was finished, at 1 o'clock, Sherman crossed with his 3 divisions, and Davis's division of the 14th Corps, which had been sent him to take the place of Osterhaus's. At 4 o'clock, Sherman seized the north end of Missionary Ridge, which was occupied only by Confederate outposts. Then, to his surprise, he found that the ridge was not continuous, but was separated by a wide depression from Tunnel Hill, his objective on the south. Viewed from below and at a distance this break in the crest of Missionary Ridge was not apparent. Sherman also found Cleburne's division in position at Tunnel Hill, and strongly entrenched. He therefore made no attempt to carry the hill that afternoon. During the night of the 24th, Bragg drew in all his troops from Lookout Mountain and Chattanooga Valley, and formed his line along Missionary Ridge from Tunnel Hill to Rossville Gap, a distance of over 6 miles. Hardee commanded the right wing, and Breckinridge the left. On the morning of the 25th, Grant stationed his headquarters at Orchard Knob, from which the whole field was in full view. The day was clear and bright, and Bragg's headquarters on the ridge could be plainly seen, with the staff officers coming and going constantly. Grant's orders for the day were as follows: Sherman was directed to attack at daylight. Hooker was ordered to move at the same hour, and endeavor to intercept the enemy's retreat if he still remained. If he had gone, then to move directly to Rossville and operate against the left and rear of the force on Missionary Ridge. Thomas was not to move until Hooker had reached Missionary Ridge. Sherman's assault, the main attack, was a complete failure. Although he had 6 divisions against Cleburne's 1, the position was too strong to be carried by frontal assault, and all his attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. Such is the strength of field works against frontal assault, and Sherman does not appear to have tried to outflank Cleburne's position. On the right Hooker had marched at daybreak, but he found the bridge over Chattanooga Creek destroyed and the roads obstructed. He was thus delayed 4 or 5 hours. From his central position on Orchard Knob, Grant watched in vain to see Hooker crossing the ridge in the neighborhood of Rossville. He saw that Sherman's assault had failed, and judged incorrectly, from some movements of the Confederate troops, that Bragg was weakening his center to reinforce Cleburne on his right. So, to relieve Sherman, he ordered Thomas to move out the 4 divisions he held at the center, assault the first line of the enemy's rifle pits in front, and there to halt and await orders. Baird was on the left, Wood next, then Sheridan, with Johnson on the extreme right. In all, 11 brigades and 4 field batteries on a front 2 miles and a half long. The men had been under arms all day, and when the order to attack came at 3:30, they advanced with a rush, eager to redeem their defeat at Chickamauga. 3 lines of entrenchments were in front of them, one at the foot of the ridge, another near the middle of the slope, the third and strongest at the crest. Through an error of the Confederate engineers, the upper line of works had been placed on the natural instead of the military crest, which left numerous approaches up ravines and swales entirely covered from the fire of the breastworks. Bragg had also made the fatal mistake of dividing his forces, already too small, putting one half in their skirmish line at the bottom of the hill, and the other half at the top. Private instructions were given the superior officers, if attacked by more than a single line of battle, to await the enemy's approach within 200 yards, then to deliver their fire, and retire to the works above. The ridge here was some 200 feet high, with steep slopes broken by many ravines and swales, and obstructed at the time by the stumps of recently felled timber. The line was held by 4 Confederate divisions, 11½ brigades, and 16 batteries. The Federals charged at double quick, and carried the first line at the point of the bayonet, killing and capturing large numbers of the defenders, and putting the rest to flight. Here the troops halted as ordered. But, finding themselves exposed to a galling fire from the enemy, by an almost spontaneous impulse the line resumed its advance up the ridge, which was carried in 6 places at the same moment. Wood and Sheridan both claimed the credit of reaching the top first. Bragg's center was broken, and his troops, after a feeble resistance, gave way and fled from the field in a panic. 37 guns and 2,000 prisoners were taken. Bragg with his entire staff narrowly escaped capture. Sheridan and Wood followed the fleeing enemy for a short distance, but the hour was too late for a general pursuit. Meanwhile Hooker had reached Rossville and driven in the Confederate left. He then advanced northward with one division on top the ridge and one on either side, until he connected about sunset with Thomas's right. During the night Cleburne withdrew from the position he had so valiantly held in front of Sherman. The following morning Sherman, Hooker, and Palmer took up the pursuit and pressed it as far as Ringgold, where the enemy made a stand on the 27th. Bragg then withdrew to Dalton, where a few days later he was relieved of the command at his own request. He was called to Richmond by President Davis, and given the position of Chief of Staff, his duties being to control military operations under the direction of the President. He did not see any more active service until the final days of the war. He was a good strategist and tactician, with great powers of organization and discipline. Grant considered him a man of the highest character, and Sherman always speaks well of him. But he had a most irritable temper, due largely to ill health, and was disliked by his officers and men. His failure to crush Rosecrans at Chickamauga was caused mainly by the disaffection of his subordinates. Owing to various reasons, Longstreet was not ready to attack Burnside at Knoxville until the 29th, and then he was repulsed with a loss of over 800 men. He was about to renew the assault when he heard of Bragg's defeat, and of the approach of large Federal reinforcements. On the 4th of December he raised the siege, and returned to Virginia. In the battles around Chattanooga, Grant had about 60,000 men, and Bragg 40,000. The losses were not heavy. Number of Federals killed was 752, Confederates 361. 4,713 wounded Federals. Confederates wounded 2,180. Missing Federals 350. Missing Confederates 4,146. Making the total losses for the Federals 5,815, and for the Confederates 6,687. Both Bragg and Alexander attribute the sudden panic which seized the veteran Confederate troops to the sight of the enemy marshaling his immense forces in plain view. General Alexander says, "The sight was a grand and impressive one, the like of which had never been seen before by any one who witnessed it." This was the only battle of the Civil War in which the topographical conditions were such that the defenders in a position, which ought to have been held by a line of skirmishers against any assaulting column, could look down upon the hosts of the enemy forming for the attack; and it was too much for the nerve of the Confederate soldiers, who were as brave as any on earth. Among the great battles of the Civil War, Chattanooga was unique in many respects. First, it was a series of 3 distinct actions, fought by the Union troops at different points on a line 13 miles in length. Second, for the first time, corps of the 3 great armies, of the Potomac, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee, fought together under one commander. Third, it was the only battle of the war in which the 4 most famous Union generals, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Thomas, were all engaged. Fourth, unlike most of the battles, the fighting was nearly all in full view of both armies. Finally, the immense length of the line, the grandeur of the scenery, the dizzy heights scaled, all combined to make it a wonderful spectacle. Owing to unforeseen obstacles, the attack of Sherman on the left was almost a complete failure. But Hooker's "Battle above the Clouds," and the assault of Missionary Ridge by the Army of the Cumberland, were both brilliant victories, owing to the irresistible élan of the soldiers, rather than the plans of the commander in chief. It is therefore absurd for Grant to claim that the battle effectually carried out his orders. Grant's orders to Thomas on the 25th were only to make another "demonstration" in behalf of Sherman, so that he could take the tunnel in accordance with the original plan. When the soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland who were "so demoralized that they would not fight," pressed on up the ridge, without orders and even against orders, Grant was very angry, and told Thomas that "some one would suffer" if the movement failed. But it won for Grant the battle of Missionary Ridge. In his official report, after narrating the events of the 23d to 25th of November, General Thomas quietly says: "It will be seen by the above report that the original plan of operations was somewhat modified to meet and take the best advantage of emergencies which necessitated material modifications of that plan." And Professor Fiske remarks: "Now, if anything in this world can be said to be clear, it is that the battle of Chattanooga was not fought as Grant had planned it." In many respects Chattanooga was the most brilliant victory of the war; remarkable not only for its picturesque features and interesting tactics, but also for its strategic importance. The Confederate line of communications between the Atlantic seaboard and the Mississippi was severed at the center, and there was no longer any connection between the sections east and west of the Alleghanies except by a long detour by way of Atlanta. It completed the recovery of the valley of the Mississippi begun by the capture of New Orleans and Vicksburg. With the exception of Hood's rash advance to Nashville at the end of the following year, the remaining campaigns of the war were fought within the limits of the original 13 States of the Union. The exultation at the North, after the great victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July, had been changed almost to despair by the terrible reverse at Chickamauga. Now, when the people sat down to their dinners on this Thanksgiving Day, as Halleck said in his telegram of congratulations, Grant had indeed given them cause for thanksgiving. It is a general rule of modern warfare that an army which allows itself to be shut up within fortifications is lost. But the Army of the Cumberland was never entirely invested, although for a time its line of supplies was over a long and difficult road. Nevertheless, the army would ultimately have been starved into surrender, or have been forced to retreat, with the loss of most of its artillery and equipage, if means had not been found to open the short piece of road, about 5 miles long, from Brown's Ferry across Raccoon Mountain to Kelly's Ferry. Neither Bragg nor Longstreet, who commanded the Confederate left, appears to have appreciated the great strategic importance of this road. It was guarded only by a small brigade, which was sent around the toe of Lookout Mountain for the purpose. "A full division at least," says General Alexander, "should have guarded so important a point, and one so exposed." Bragg lost his campaign primarily when he allowed the enemy to reopen the short line of his communications. Chapter 16. July, 1863 to May, 1864. The Wilderness. 10 days after the battle of Gettysburg, on the night of the 13th of July, 1863, Lee crossed the Potomac, and then continued his retreat slowly up the Shenandoah Valley. The last week in July Meade also passed the river, and marched south along the east side of the Blue Ridge. Lee thereupon left the valley, and took position near Culpeper. Meade continued his advance, and placed his army on the north side of the Rappahannock. The end of July, Lee withdrew across the Rapidan to Orange Court House, where he could receive supplies by rail. At this time, Longstreet again called attention to the plan suggested by him the previous May, of taking advantage of the interior lines of the Confederacy to transfer troops to the West. About the 23d of August, Lee was called to Richmond, and was detained there by President Davis for nearly 2 weeks. During this time, it was decided to send Longstreet with the divisions of Hood and McLaws to reinforce Bragg at Chattanooga. As soon as Lee withdrew behind the Rapidan, Meade again advanced, and posted his army along the north bank of the river. Learning of the departure of Longstreet, the authorities at Washington detached the 11th and 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac, and sent them west, under the command of Hooker, to reinforce Rosecrans. This reduced Meade to the defensive; and there then ensued a campaign of manoeuvres, marked by much marching and strategy, but little fighting or tactics. Meade was gradually forced back until he took a strong position on the heights of Centreville, almost in sight of the defenses of Washington, behind which he could retire within a few hours. As Lee was now a long way from his base, he fell back to his former position at Culpeper. Meade immediately followed, crossing the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford on the 7th of November, and turning the Confederate right; thereupon Lee retired once more to the south side of the Rapidan. The last week in November, Meade crossed the river at Germanna Ford, with the object of surprising the Confederates in their extended winter quarters, but Lee was warned of the movement by his cavalry, and Meade found him so strongly entrenched along Mine Run, that he did not deem it prudent to attack. He quietly recrossed the river, and both armies resumed their quarters along the Rapidan. Here Meade and Lee were content to watch each other across the river until the following May. In February, 1864, Congress revived the grade of lieutenant general which had first been conferred on Washington in 1798. President Lincoln, as was generally expected, immediately appointed Grant to the office, and made him general in chief of all the armies of the United States. Grant was personally assured by the President that he would be allowed full freedom of action, and be supported by all the resources of the government. Grant states that it was his first intention to remain in the West, but he soon realized that this was not practicable. He accordingly recommended the appointment of Sherman to his former command. Early in March, Grant visited Meade at his headquarters at Brandy Station, and at that time requested him to remain in command of the Army of the Potomac. This proved to be a cumbersome arrangement, as it made it necessary to transmit all orders through Meade, instead of giving them direct to the corps commanders, and was often embarrassing to Grant. At this time the South had left in the field only two considerable forces: Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and the two Western armies of Tennessee and Mississippi, now consolidated under General Joseph E. Johnston, at Dalton, Georgia. For the first time since the beginning of the Civil War, a definite plan was now adopted by the Union government for a simultaneous and concentrated movement of all the Federal forces toward a single objective: the destruction of these two remaining organized bodies of Confederate troops. Before this time the various Union armies had acted separately and independently of each other, giving the enemy an opportunity often of depleting one command not pressed, to reinforce another more actively engaged. Grant was determined to stop this. He regarded the Union forces as one large army, of which the Army of the Potomac was the center, Sherman's army the right wing, and the Army of the James, under Butler, the left wing. There was to be a simultaneous movement all along the line. Sherman was to move from Chattanooga; Crook in West Virginia was to move against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad; Sigel was to advance up the Shenandoah Valley; Butler was to move by the James River on Petersburg and Richmond. So far as the main armies under Grant and Sherman were concerned, this plan was carried out successfully, but some of the details did not work out as expected. Butler allowed his army to be "bottled up" by Beauregard, and Sigel did nothing but retreat. Grant established his headquarters at Culpeper on the 26th of March. The First and Third Corps had been suppressed, and their divisions transferred to the Second, Fifth, and Sixth Corps, which were retained. Upon the reorganization of the army, General Hancock, who had been absent owing to wounds received at Gettysburg, resumed command of the Second Corps. General Warren was appointed to the command of the Fifth Corps. General Sedgwick continued at the head of the Sixth Corps; and General Sheridan was brought on from the West to command the Cavalry Corps. The Ninth Corps, under General Burnside, joined the army on the 6th of May, but was not formally incorporated in the Army of the Potomac until the 24th of May. Longstreet had rejoined Lee with his two divisions which took part in the Chickamauga campaign, and the Confederate army was still organized the same as at Gettysburg, except that Pickett was absent. The organizations of the two armies at the beginning of the campaign were as follows: Army of the Potomac, Second Corps, Hancock, 27,000 men; Fifth Corps, Warren, 24,000; Sixth Corps, Sedgwick, 23,000 men; Ninth Corps, Burnside, 19,000; and the Cavalry Corps, Sheridan, 12,000. Army of the Potomac total was 105,000. Army of Northern Virginia, First Corps, Longstreet, 15,000. Second Corps, Ewell, 17,000. The Third Corps, Hill, 22,000. Cavalry Corps Stewart, 8,500. And artillery and miscellaneous, 6,500, bringing the total of the Army of Northern Virginia to 69,000. Pickett's division of 5,000 men did not join Lee until the last of May; he therefore had only 64,000 men at the beginning of the campaign. The Union army had 15 divisions, 40 brigades of infantry, 3 divisions, 6 brigades of cavalry, and 242 guns. The Confederate army had 9 divisions, 40 brigades of infantry, 3 divisions, 7 brigades of cavalry, and 224 guns. That part of the Union army not engaged in guarding the lines of communication was on the northern bank of the Rapidan. It was confronted on the opposite side of the river by the Confederate forces in a strongly entrenched position, which was almost impregnable against direct attack. The country back to the James River was cut up with many streams, generally narrow, deep, and difficult to cross, except where bridged. The region was heavily timbered, the roads narrow, and almost impassable after the least rain. It would be hard to find a country more difficult for manoeuvring and supplying a large army. As already stated, Grant's main objective was Lee's army, and as it was practically unassailable in front, he decided to turn its right flank. He hoped by concealment and celerity to cross the Rapidan and traverse the Wilderness on the south side, before Lee could discover his movement, or at least before Lee could have time to oppose it. On the 2nd day of May, 1864, General Lee, surrounded by his corps and division commanders, stood at the Confederate signal station on Clark's Mountain, south of the Rapidan, and examined through his field glass the position of the Federal army across the river. Although several demonstrations had been made in the direction of the upper fords, General Lee expressed the opinion that the Union army would cross at Germanna or Ely's. 36 hours later the Army of the Potomac began its march to the fords indicated by him. Grant issued his orders for the movement on the 2nd of May, and the troops began their march at midnight on the 3rd. Sheridan, with 2 of his cavalry divisions, led the way, and the 3rd was left to cover the rear. 2 pontoon bridges had been laid at Germanna, and 2 more at Ely's Ford, where Hooker crossed 12 months before, and a 5th was laid between at Culpeper Mine Ford. Hancock's corps, preceded by Gregg's cavalry division, after crossing the river, took the road from Ely's Ford to Chancellorsville, where it arrived at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 4th, followed by the reserve artillery. The corps remained there all day, waiting for the trains to come up, and bivouacked that night on the old battlefield. The cavalry pushed on to Piney Branch Church, and from there threw out patrols on all the roads. Warren's corps, preceded by Wilson's cavalry division, marched by way of Germanna Ford, and bivouacked the night of the 4th at the old Wilderness Tavern, at the junction of the road from the ford with the turnpike, just about a mile west of the point where Jackson's turning column struck the pike on the afternoon of the 2nd of May the previous year. Sedgwick's corps followed the same route, and passed that night along the road just south of the ford. The cavalry moved on to Parker's store, throwing out patrols on all the roads from that point. Up to this time, the movement had been carried out successfully. The 3 corps were all south of the Rapidan, and no opposition had been encountered. But for the great train of 5,000 wagons, the army might have moved further south, and been out of the Wilderness on the morning of the 5th. Although the baggage had been cut down to the smallest limit, the ammunition, 10 days' rations, and 3 days' forage filled a train which, in Grant's words, "would have extended from the Rapidan to Richmond, stretched along in single file." The army could not move on until the trains were up, and they did not finish crossing at Culpeper Mine and Ely's Fords until after 5 o'clock on the afternoon of the 5th. Thus a whole precious day was lost, and Grant, much against his will, was forced to fight a battle in the Wilderness. As already stated, Lee had not been deceived by the feints made on his left, and had anticipated Grant's movement. As usual, he took no steps to prevent the passage of the river, but made his plans to strike the Union army in flank before it could get out of the Wilderness. Lee's headquarters were 2 miles northeast of Orange Court House. Ewell's corps was on and near the Rapidan. Hill's higher up the river on the left, and Longstreet's in the rear near Gordonsville. Two roads led from Lee's position down the Rapidan toward Fredericksburg, both following the general direction of the river, and almost parallel to each other. The old turnpike nearest the stream and the plank road, a short distance south of it. The route of the Federal army lay directly across these two roads along the western borders of the famous Wilderness. About noon on the 4th of May, Ewell's corps was put in motion along the turnpike, while Hill with two divisions started by the plank road. The two divisions of Longstreet's corps at Gordonsville were ordered to march rapidly across country and follow Hill on the plank road. As Ewell's corps advanced along the turnpike on the morning of the 5th, a Federal column was seen crossing it from the direction of Germanna Ford. Ewell promptly deployed his troops across the turnpike, and sent word to Lee, who was with Hill on the plank road. Lee ordered him to avoid bringing on a general engagement until Longstreet could come up, and to regulate his movements by the head of Hill's column, whose progress he could tell by the firing in its front. But his position was so near the flank of the Federal column that a collision soon occurred which opened the campaign in earnest. Warren, whose corps was passing when Ewell came up, halted, formed a line of battle, and vigorously attacked Johnson's division posted across the turnpike. The Confederates were driven back; but Rodes's division was thrown in on Johnson's right, south of the road, and the Federal attack was finally repulsed. The fighting was severe while it lasted, and the losses quite heavy. Ewell's entire corps was now up, and Sedgwick soon joined Warren on his right. Early's division was sent to meet Sedgwick, while the two other divisions continued to confront Warren. The Federals kept up their attacks until nightfall, but could not drive off the enemy. Although the heads of the two Confederate columns had bivouacked on the night of the 4th within 5 miles of the Union camps, Grant does not seem to have been aware of the nearness of the enemy. Note: There's an outline map of Lee's positions in the Wilderness, on page 334. When Warren was attacked the next morning, Meade is said to have remarked, "They have left a division to fool us here, while they concentrate and prepare a position on the North Anna." If General Meade had any such idea he must soon have been undeceived by Hill's attack along the plank road, which struck the Federal outposts at Parker's Store soon after Ewell became engaged on the turnpike. The Union patrols were driven in, and followed up to their line of battle, which covered the junction of the plank road with the Stevensburg and Brock roads, by which the Federals were marching. The fight began between Heth's division at the head of Hill's column, and Getty's division of the Sixth Corps. Hancock's corps, which was already 2 miles beyond Todd's Tavern, was recalled, and was ordered to drive Hill out of the Wilderness. The character of the Wilderness has already been described in connection with the Chancellorsville campaign. For more than 100 years iron mines had been worked within it, and the great trees of the primeval forests had been cut as fuel for the furnaces. The land was now covered in a dense second growth of cedar, pine, and black oak. In his report, Hancock says that the forest was "almost impenetrable by troops in line of battle," and "maneuvering was an operation of extreme difficulty and uncertainty. The undergrowth was so heavy that it was scarcely possible to see more than 100 paces in any direction. The movements of the enemy could not be observed until the lines were almost in collision." General Law writes, "It was a battle of brigades and regiments rather than of corps and divisions. Officers could not see the whole length of their commands, and could tell whether the troops on their right and left were driving or being driven only by the sound of the firing. It was a fight at close quarters, too, for as night came on, in these tangled thickets, the approach of the opposing lines could be discerned only by the noise of their passage through the underbrush or the flashing of their guns." At 2 o'clock the head of Hancock's column reached the plank road. As his divisions came up, they were formed on Getty's left, in front of and along the Brock road, by which Jackson had made his turning movement the year before. Instead of engaging the enemy at once as ordered, Hancock spent about an hour in completing the entrenchments begun by Getty, which gave Hill time to select and prepare his ground. At 4:15, Getty advanced to the attack. he met with such stubborn resistance that Hancock sent 2 divisions to his assistance. The lines were very close, and a most desperate combat now ensued. Another Federal division was sent in, but Heth had been reinforced by Wilcox, and the Confederate line held fast. The fighting did not cease until after dark. Late in the afternoon, Grant sent Wadsworth's division of the Fifth Corps to Hancock's assistance, but it was so much delayed by the tangled underbrush that night fell before it got in position. As soon as the fighting ended on the night of the 5th, Grant issued orders to renew the battle at 5 o'clock the next morning. It was near midday on the 4th, says General Alexander, when Longstreet, at his camp 6 miles south of Gordonsville, received news that Grant was crossing the Rapidan, and orders from General Lee to march to Todd's Tavern on the Brock Road. He was directed to march all night, only stopping to feed and water. At 4 o'clock he was on the way, and kept it up until near sundown the next day, when his corps bivouacked near Craig's Church on the Carpathin Road, having marched about 36 miles. Longstreet at this time had with him only Hood's old division, under the command of Field, and McLaw's division, under Kershaw, about 10,000 men. Pickett's division of 5,000 men was with Beauregard, and did not return until the last of May. The troops were ordered to rest until 1 a.m. before resuming their march. But, before starting, orders came from Lee to cross over to Parker's store on the Plank Road, about 6 miles. It was after sunrise on the 6th before Longstreet reached this position, 3 miles in the rear of Hill's front line. During the night both armies strengthened their field works and made preparations for the coming struggle. All day long on the 5th there had been a wide gap between the 2 wings of the line of battle, between Warren and Hancock on the Union side, and between Ewell and Hill on the Confederate side. In fact, 2 distinct battles had been fought on fields more than a mile apart. Early in the afternoon of the 4th, Grant had telegraphed Burnside at Brandy Station to make a forced march to Germanna Ford, and by the night of the 5th 3 of his 4 divisions were across the river. He was now ordered to place 2 of his divisions, Potter and Wilcox, in the gap between Warren and Hancock, and to be in position to advance at 5 o'clock in the morning with the rest of the army. The 3rd division of his corps, Stevenson, then south of the river, was to remain in reserve at the Wilderness Tavern. At dawn on the 6th, Hancock's troops advanced to the attack. The blow fell with greatest force on Wilcox's division south of the Plank Road. The whole Confederate line was "rolled up" from the right, and the troops fell back in disorder along the Plank Road until they reached the position of Pogue's artillery, which now opened on the attacking force. The Federals pressed on until abreast of the battery, and their musketry fire reached the guns where General Lee himself stood. Matters looked very serious for the Confederates, but Lee sent messengers to hurry the movement of Longstreet's corps, which soon appeared swinging down the Plank Road at double quick. Kershaw's division took the right of the road and moved obliquely south to meet the Federal left, which had pivoted toward the north. The Union advance was checked, and the troops driven back to their breastworks, which were soon carried by the Confederate rush. At the same time, Field's division deployed along the left side of the road and advanced to the attack. As they passed General Lee, the men gave a rousing cheer for "Marse Robert," who spurred his horse forward to take part in the charge. As soon as the troops realized that he was "going in" with them, there was a general cry of "We won't go unless you go back." One of the men seized the bridle and turned the general's horse around, and he reluctantly rode over to join General Longstreet on the Plank Road. Field's troops struck the right of Hancock's line, and after a bloody combat, finally succeeded in carrying the entrenchments. Here the storm of battle swept to and fro for more than 2 hours, and the works were taken and retaken several times. General Wadsworth was killed as he rode up close to the front of his line on the Plank Road. About 10 o'clock, Longstreet ascertained that the Union left south of the Plank Road was in the air, and sent Mahone with his own and 3 other brigades to make a turning movement. The Federal line attacked in flank and rear, and in front at the same time, was rolled up in confusion toward the Plank Road, and then back upon the Brock Road. Mahone's turning column was now in position facing north on the south side of the Plank Road, and parallel to it. General Longstreet prepared to press his advantage, and ordered Jenkins' fresh brigade, supported by Kershaw's division, to move forward on the plank road and renew the attack. As Longstreet rode forward with Jenkins and Kershaw along the road, a sudden volley from Mahone's men killed Jenkins, and wounded Longstreet in the neck. The Confederates had failed to recognize their friends through the intervening thickets, and this unfortunate volley practically lost them the fruits of the success they had just won. It was almost an exact repetition of the killing of Jackson on this same field the year before. Lee came up in a few minutes and took personal charge of the attack. But, although Longstreet explained to him the situation and his plans, Lee did not care to handle broken lines, and ordered a formation for parallel battle. This delayed the attack until after 4 o'clock. Then a part of Hancock's front line was carried. But by 5 o'clock the Confederates had been repulsed, and driven back with heavy loss. Meanwhile, Burnside's corps had taken but small part in the battle. The divisions of Wilcox and Potter, which were ordered to enter the gap between Ewell and Hill, did not get into position before 2 o'clock. By that time, Heth and Wilcox had closed the gap, and the Union attack was repulsed. Late in the afternoon, under the personal direction of General Lee, Ewell made an attack on the Union right, similar to that by which Longstreet had rolled up Hancock's left in the morning. Two brigades, under General Gordon, took the Federal line in reverse, and Sedgwick's corps was driven from a large portion of its works with the loss of 600 prisoners, including Generals Seymour and Shaler. Night closed the combat, and the Battle of the Wilderness was over. The losses on both sides were as follows: Federals killed, 2,246; Confederates, 2,000; wounded Federals, 12,037; wounded Confederates, 6,000; missing Federals, 3,383; Confederates, 3,400, making the total losses for the Federals 17,666, and for the Confederates 11,400. Livermore estimates the numbers engaged as 102,000 Federals, 61,000 Confederates. Grant's main objective in this campaign was Lee's army, and not Richmond. In its entrenchments behind the Rapidan this army was unassailable in front, and it was necessary to turn one or the other of its flanks. To accomplish this object, three plans were possible. 1. To transport the Union army by water to the near vicinity of Richmond. 2. To move by the Federal right against Lee's left flank. 3. To move by the Federal left against the enemy's right flank. The latter plan was adopted. In his Memoirs, Grant states his reasons as follows: "At this time, I was not entirely decided as to whether I should move the Army of the Potomac by the right flank of the enemy, or by his left. Each plan presented advantages. If by his right, my left, the Potomac, Chesapeake Bay, and tributaries, would furnish us an easy line over which to bring all supplies to within easy hauling distance of every position the army could occupy from the Rapidan to the James River. But Lee could, if he chose, detach or move his whole army north on a line rather interior to the one I would have to take in following. A movement by his left, our right, would obviate this. But all that was done would have to be done with the supplies and ammunition we started with. All idea of adopting this latter plan was abandoned when the limited quantity of supplies possible to take with us was considered. The country over which we would have to pass was so exhausted of all food or forage, that we would be obliged to carry everything with us." From the above, it is evident that Grant did not even consider McClellan's plan of moving his troops by water to the neighborhood of Richmond. The reason for this may have been political rather than military. "Many of us thought," writes Mr. Everett P. Wheeler, "that politics had something to do with the plan that was adopted. McClellan had been removed from command, and was at his home in Trenton, subject to order but receiving none. He was a conspicuous figure in the political debates, and many at the North still believed in him. Naturally, the leaders of the Democratic party looked to him as an available candidate in the Presidential election of 1864. Many felt that McClellan's plan of assaulting Richmond from the south on the line of the James River was the true plan, and that the nature of the country between Washington and Richmond was such that the Confederates could not be defeated if assailed on that line. Therefore, when Grant undertook to march directly across that rugged and broken country, which was aptly called the Wilderness, and to attack Lee in the front, many thought that the wiser plan of campaign had been given up, because to adopt it would have been to reflect credit upon the discarded leader. Certain it is that Grant's frontal attacks on Lee were bloody and unsuccessful. On this same point General Humphreys says: "The question has been asked why the Army of the Potomac was not moved by water to the near vicinity of Richmond, where, by taking possession of the lines of supply of that great military depot, the force defending it would be obliged to assume the offensive and attack the enveloping army in its intrenchments. But it is not to be supposed that Lee would have withdrawn to and remained within the carefully prepared fortifications enclosing Richmond while this transfer was being made, but that he would have advanced beyond the city, and that by his entrenching and continuing to extend and entrench, the Army of the Potomac would have been forced to attack constantly in order to gain possession of those lines of supply at a suitable distance from Richmond, and while extending its enveloping lines, would have been subject to attack on the extending flank under unfavorable circumstances." As this is exactly what finally occurred, it is difficult to see much point to this argument. The overland route to Richmond had been tried 5 times: by McDowell in 1861, by Pope and Burnside in 1862, by Hooker and Meade in 1863, and had proved a failure every time. Under Grant in 1864, it again proved a failure. At every turn he found Lee across his path, and was unable to drive him off. Finally, after 6 weeks of the hardest fighting in the Civil War, and the loss of 55,000 men, a number nearly equal to Lee's whole army, Grant was to find himself on the James River, with Fortress Monroe as his base, where his fleet might have landed him at the beginning, and without losing a man. "Here at last," says General Alexander, "literally driven into the location in front of Petersburg, Grant found himself in a position of rare strategic advantage, certain to give him possession of Richmond if properly utilized." This position was literally "the key to Richmond," for it would force Lee to hold an exterior line of such enormous strength, nearly 30 miles, that it could not be long maintained. A move by Grant's right flank had the apparent advantages that the rivers were smaller and more easily passed in that quarter, and the country was more open and better suited for the manoeuvring of large forces. But he would have been operating on a front parallel to his line of communications, the Orange and Alexandria Railway, which would require a large force for its protection; while Lee would have operated on a front perpendicular to his communications with Richmond. On the other hand, in moving by his left flank, Grant had short lines of supply entirely protected to navigable waters connected with his main depots. The only drawback was the unfavorable character of the country for the distance of 10 or 15 miles south of the Rapidan; but Grant hoped by concealing his movements to cross the river and traverse the Wilderness before Lee had time to attack. In this expectation he was disappointed, owing to the necessity of waiting for his trains to come up, and it is difficult to understand why he had any such hopes. "It was well known," writes General Humphreys, Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac, "that daylight could divulge our movement to Lee's signal officers on Clark's Mountain; and it was believed that he would at once move by the Orange and Fredericksburg pike and plank roads to oppose us." "No poorer cavalry work was done in the Civil War," says Major Steele, "than that done by the cavalry of Sheridan and Stuart in the afternoon and evening of the 4th of May and the early morning of the 5th of May, 1864. In excuse of Stuart, however, it should be explained that Lee had sent him over to Fredericksburg to obtain forage for his lean horses, and he did not rejoin the army until the 5th. For Sheridan and 2 of his division commanders, Torbert and Wilson, it may be said that they had had practically no cavalry experience before they were given their high commands in the Army of the Potomac. Wilson was an engineer officer, and the service of Sheridan and Torbert had been with the infantry. Later, both Sheridan and Wilson learned their lesson and performed most efficient service. Lee again showed his sublime audacity in attacking a Union army of twice his strength. His only error was in not calling up Longstreet sooner. He had 42 miles to march, while Hill had 28 and Ewell only 18. If Longstreet had been close behind Hill on the plank road on the morning of the 5th, Hancock's corps might have been cut off and overwhelmed. The bad tactics of the Wilderness can be attributed to the difficult character of the country. There was no plan of battle on either side, no simultaneous concerted effort either to turn the enemy's flank or pierce his center. The first day there were two distinct battles, one on the plank road and the other on the turnpike. On the second day, the Confederates turned the left of the Federals in the morning and their right in the evening. Either of these flank attacks might have given decisive results. But the first failed on account of the wounding of Longstreet, and the second was made so late in the day that there was no time to gather the fruits of the victory. The Wilderness is unique among battles, as presenting the novel spectacle of an army of 60,000 men enveloping both flanks of an army of 100,000. End of chapter 16. 17. May to June 1864. Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. After the bloody but indecisive battle of the Wilderness, Lee expected that Grant would retreat, as his predecessors in command of the Army of the Potomac, Pope and Burnside and Hooker, had invariably done under similar circumstances. And probably this expectation was shared by every man in the Union army. But when Grant arose at dawn the next morning, thoroughly refreshed after a sound sleep, the first thing he did at 6:30 A.M. on the 7th of May, was to issue his orders for a night march of the entire army toward Spotsylvania Court House, on the direct road to Richmond. The Federal situation is well summed up by Colonel Henderson in these words: "Now here was Grant, a stranger to his troops, face to face with the hero of the war, the man before whom so many generals had gone down. He had fought him for 2 days in the Wilderness, and if he had escaped defeat he had lost a great many more men than Lee, and the fighting all through had certainly not been in the Federal favor. The morning after the battle they brought in a list of losses: 15,000 men. And the enemy was still there and not retreating. Grant had to decide what to do. It was little use attacking the enemy in his intrenchments. There seemed no hope of success, and the army would not have been surprised had he followed the example of his predecessors and retreated. But despite his losses, despite the demoralization of his troops, despite the fact that he had not won 1 inch of ground, he determined to move forward, to follow out his original plan, and if possible to cut Lee off from Richmond, or at all events to force him to battle in a less impregnable position than the one he now held. This was the turning point in the campaign. As a commander, Grant cannot be compared with General Lee, undoubtedly one of the greatest soldiers, if not the greatest, who ever spoke the English tongue. But he possessed the determination, the perseverance, the fixed resolve to conquer, which enabled him to triumph over obstacles before which men of weaker fiber would have turned aside. He was endowed with that almost indefinable force which Napoleon declared was 3 times more effective than physical means, that is, than numbers, armament, and position. In other words, Grant relied far more on the moral effect of his manoeuvres than on the mere fighting qualities of his troops, and it was this which finally brought him success. It was perhaps to this that Napoleon referred when he said that reading and meditating on the wars of the greatest captains is the only way of learning the science of war. In order to appreciate fully Grant's difficulties, and his strength of character, we must remember that, with strange troops, who had far more dread of Lee than confidence in himself, he was to continue his campaign against that formidable adversary in a most difficult country, which was far better known to Lee and his officers than to any one in the Union army. The few maps available were not reliable. The theater of war was covered with primeval forest and very thinly populated. There were immense tracts of swamp and jungle which were terra incognita to all but a few farmers and their negro slaves. The roads were as scarce and as indifferent as the maps. There were many unfordable streams, crossed by few bridges at long intervals. The country produced but little food or forage, and the invaders had to carry both their supplies and their ammunition. Under Grant's orders, Hancock's corps, on the left of the line, was to remain in position until the trains and the other army corps marched by his rear. The trains were started in the afternoon of the 7th, and the troops moved at 8:30. Warren marched by the Brock road; Sedgwick, followed by Burnside, moved by way of Chancellorsville, Aldrich's, and Piney Branch Church. Hancock was ordered to follow Warren to Todd's Tavern. The cavalry preceded the infantry columns, and covered the flanks and rear. The troops began their march in a state of great discouragement, under the impression that they were to retire once more behind the Rapidan. But when they came to the cross roads the command was, "Column right." "Soon after dark," writes General Porter, "Generals Grant and Meade, accompanied by their staffs, rode along the Brock road toward Hancock's headquarters, with the intention of waiting there till Warren's troops should reach that point." Then occurred an unexpected demonstration which was one of the most memorable scenes of the campaign. In spite of the darkness, Grant was recognized. The men then understood that the watchword was to be, "On to Richmond." Wild cheers echoed through the forest, and glad shouts of triumph rent the air. The night march had become a triumphal procession for the new commander. Grant sent his staff officers along the line to urge the men to keep quiet so as not to attract the enemy's attention. On the afternoon of the 7th, Lee was informed by Stuart of the movement of the Federal trains, and he was convinced that Grant's objective was Spotsylvania Court House. He at once ordered Anderson, now commanding Longstreet's corps, to make a night march for the same point, and sent Stuart's cavalry to retard the Federals as much as possible, in order to enable Anderson to reach Spotsylvania first, and take up position. In the race for the Court House, Grant had a little the worse of the luck. His route was somewhat the longer of the two, but his troops started at 8:30 P.M. on the 7th, while the Confederate corps was not to march until 3 A.M. on the 8th. Luckily for Lee, however, Anderson took the responsibility of starting at an hour before midnight, in order to escape from the blazing woods which had been set on fire by the battle. This enabled Anderson to win the race. The Confederate cavalry felled trees across the Brock road, and disputed every foot of ground, so that the progress of Warren's column was much delayed. It was half after 8 the next morning before the leading division, Robinson, emerged from the woods into open ground at Alsop's, about 2 miles and a half from the Court House. As the division advanced across the clearing, toward a dense pine thicket on the further side, it was met by a staggering musketry and artillery fire from the Confederate breastworks, and driven back to the shelter of the woods in the rear. Robinson was badly wounded. Griffin came up on his right, but was also forced back, until the two other divisions, Crawford and Wadsworth now under Cutler, of the Fifth Corps arrived and took part in the engagement. Warren then advanced, and entrenched a position from 200 to 400 yards in front of the Confederate line. Several roads came together at the Court House, from Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, now the Union base, as well as from the east and south. This gave the place a strategic value, and made it the field of the battle. The troops on both sides now came up rapidly. Sedgwick joined Warren, and in the afternoon his corps vigorously assaulted Anderson's right wing, which, assisted by the timely arrival of Ewell's corps, repulsed the attack with great slaughter. Hill's corps, now under the command of General Early, did not arrive until the next morning, the 9th. General Lee's line now covered the Court House with its left, Longstreet's corps resting on a small stream called the Po River. Ewell's corps was in the center, north of the Court House, and Hill's on the right, covering the Fredericksburg road. These positions were generally maintained during the battle, although troops were frequently shifted from one point of the line to another. Note: a sketch of the positions of the Army Corps in Spotsylvania can be found on page 348. The sketches show how skillfully Lee had made his dispositions. Like Napoleon, he had an extraordinary eye for ground, and relied largely on natural features in his defensive tactics. Throughout this campaign, in the midst of woods, jungle, and streams, with very little time at his disposal, he always seems to have selected positions of great strength. His eye for ground had much to do with his successful resistance to Grant's overwhelming numbers. At Spotsylvania, Lee's front, between the Po and the Ny, was well adapted to his smaller forces, and his line was far stronger than that held in the Wilderness. In order to turn his position, Grant would have to cross one of the streams, and so divide his army, giving Lee an opportunity of dealing with him in detail. The country was thickly wooded, and the Federals still had the same difficulty of finding out where the enemy was and in what direction his intrenchments ran. On the 9th of May began what is called the Battle of Spotsylvania, which was really a series of engagements lasting about 9 days. The first 2 days were occupied mainly in reconnoitring. This work is usually done by cavalry, but they were of no use at all in such a country, and reconnaissances enforced by brigades of infantry were therefore the only means by which Grant could find out anything about the enemy. The skirmishers and sharpshooters were very active on both sides during the day, and General Sedgwick was killed close to the intrenchments to the right of his line. General Wright then took command of the Sixth Corps. By this time it had been ascertained that the Confederate line ran from the Po, at a point 600 yards above the crossing of the Shady Grove Church Road, to a point half a mile south of the Fredericksburg Road, a distance of more than 4 miles. It enclosed the court house on the northwest, north, and east, and covered the road southward toward Richmond. The most marked feature of the line was a salient at the center, a sort of loop a half-mile wide from east to west, having a sharp apex upon a high open point a quarter of a mile north by east from the McCool house. At the salient, the line turned southeast for about 600 or 700 yards, with the woods about the McCool house behind it, and fairly open ground in front. Then it ran in a southerly direction for a mile and a half, with the ground in front partly broken and wooded and partly open. From left to right, the line was held in the following order: Longstreet's corps, under Anderson; Ewell's around the loop in the center; Hill's, except Anderson's old division, now under Mahone, which was on the extreme left overlooking the Po; Early's old division, now under Gordon, which was in reserve, was employed in digging a trench at the base of the salient, about 400 yards south of the McCool house. Hancock occupied the right of the Union line in an intrenchment overlooking the Po. Warren was next in front of Anderson. Wright was on the left. Burnside, with the Ninth Corps, was still near the Ny River on the Fredericksburg Road. On arriving, Burnside had encountered a small force of dismounted Confederate cavalry, which he mistook for infantry. This led Grant to believe that Lee was about to move against his line of communications with Fredericksburg, and he ordered Hancock to cross the Po and reconnoiter Lee's left. By 9 o'clock Hancock had passed the river with the 3 divisions of Barlow, Gibbon, and Birney. His 4th division, Mott, which came up late, had been sent to the left to Wright's corps. During the night he had 3 bridges built across the Po, to secure his retreat, and pushed on to the bridge of Shady Grove Road, known as the Blockhouse, because of a house near it, built of squared logs. Here he found the Confederate line too strong to attack. About 10 A.M. on the 10th, Hancock received an order to leave one of his divisions to threaten the Confederate left, and return, with his 2 other divisions, to command an attack to be made at 5 o'clock with his own corps, and the corps of Warren and Wright. After his departure, Barlow's division, which he left behind, was attacked by the Confederates and finally driven back over the river. The enemy then prolonged his lines a mile upon the high ground, thus covering the approach by the Shady Grove Church Road. During the day, Warren and Wright had been feeling out the lines in their front, and the former reported the opportunity was so favorable that he was ordered to attack at once, without awaiting Hancock's return. The assault was made about 4 o'clock by the Fifth and Sixth Corps, and 2 divisions, Mott and Gibbon, of the Second. The troops reached the Confederate lines, but were all driven back, with heavy loss. At 7 o'clock, Hancock made a second attack with Birney's and Gibbon's divisions, supported by part of the Fifth Corps, but this also was repulsed, with heavy loss. General Alexander thinks that Burnside's mistake, mentioned above, was most fortunate for Lee, as it led to Grant's sending Hancock prematurely across the Po, and then withdrawing him. If he had remained upon that flank, and been reinforced by Warren, it is hard to see how he could have failed completely to turn Lee's flank, and get upon his communications which now ran to Louisa C. H. While these affairs were going on upon the Confederate left, Grant was preparing for an assault upon the weakest point of their line, the salient at the center. The attack was made at 5 o'clock by 3 brigades under Colonel Upton. The works were carried, but the Federals were finally driven back with a loss of about 1,000 men, or 20% of the attacking column. The total Federal losses for the day were over 4,000. Upton's attack was to have been supported by Mott, but the division, when it attempted to advance, was broken up by a severe artillery fire, and fell back. The next day, the 11th, was rainy and disagreeable, and no serious fighting took place. Grant thought that Upton's failure was due to lack of support, and he made his plans for a much more formidable assault on the salient by the whole of the Second and Ninth Corps. The point of attack was to be the apex of the loop afterwards known as the Bloody Angle. Owing to misleading reports of a Federal movement on his left, Lee believed that Grant was preparing for another flank march. He therefore ordered all of the guns withdrawn at sundown from the parts of his line nearest the enemy, so as to be ready to move quickly. Consequently, when the attack came, the guns had all been removed from the salient, which was untenable without artillery. This was a fatal mistake, as will soon appear. There was no moon, and heavy rain was falling when the Federals began their movement. Hancock's arrangement is interesting, but it failed from errors in formation. Barlow's division was formed in 2 columns of 2 brigades each; Birney's in 2 lines, and Mott's in 1. Gibbon's division was deployed in the rear. The columns were 10 ranks, or 20 men deep. All officers were dismounted, and the division and brigade commanders, with their staffs, marched in the center between the lines. In Barlow's division there was so little distance between the ranks, that soon after the advance began it was a solid mass. The assault, which had been ordered for 4 A.M., was delayed 35 minutes by the fog. The distance to the Confederate works was about 1,200 yards. Urgent calls had been sent for the return of the 22 Confederate guns, but only 2 arrived in time, and these only fired 3 rounds before they were captured with the rest. If these guns had been in place, the charge could not have succeeded. On no other occasion during the Civil War was such a target presented to so large a force of artillery. The Federals came with such a rush that the Confederates were overwhelmed before they had a chance to fire more than 2 or 3 scattered volleys. Johnson was captured with one of his brigadiers. In all, 4,000 prisoners were taken, with 30 colors and 20 guns. The first assault had been a great success, but no further advantage was gained. Lee hurried up reinforcements from the right and left, and put in all his reserves. The Confederate line was reformed behind the trench at the south end of the salient. The Federals were much disorganized by their victory, and it was difficult to reform their lines within the salient. It was reported to Grant that Hancock had been checked, and at 8 o'clock 8 brigades from the Sixth Corps were sent to his assistance. In the confined space these reinforcements only added to the confusion. In the meantime, at 5 A.M., Potter's division of the Ninth Corps had attacked the extreme right of the Confederate line, carried the works, and captured 2 guns; but the Federals were soon driven back, and the guns retaken. The Federals were finally driven out of the salient, but the combat there lasted all day, and till after midnight. It was, perhaps, the most desperate and the most sanguinary conflict of the whole war. At one time 24 Union brigades were engaged in assaulting a few hundred yards of the entrenchments. The men stood from 20 to 40 deep outside the parapet. One tree 22 inches in diameter was literally cut down by the bullets. There was some fighting during the day by Warren on the right, and Burnside on the left of the Union line, but little was accomplished beyond preventing Lee from sending more reinforcements to his center. The Union losses in killed and wounded on the 12th of May were about 6,800; the Confederate casualties between 4,000 and 5,000. Hancock suffered the most, his corps losing about 2,500 men. The Federal generals Wright and Webb were wounded. On the Confederate side, 2 general officers were killed, 4 severely wounded, and 2 captured. On the 11th of May General Grant sent his famous dispatch that he would "fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer." On the 12th came the famous assault on the Bloody Angle, which failed because of over concentration, as the charge of Pickett's division at Gettysburg had miscarried because of too light formation. "The military lesson to be learned from the failure of Hancock's assault," says General Alexander, "is, that there is a maximum limit to the force which can be advantageously used in any locality, and a superfluity may paralyze all efforts." As explained by Colonel Henderson, however, the failure was not due so much to a superfluity of force, as to its unwise employment. "The principle is," he says, "that you mass opposite one point a great wedge which you intend to drive into the enemy's line, and that this wedge is composed of several lines one behind the other, at such distance as may best suit the ground and the situation. But it is a great point to remember that you should have a force behind this wedge in order to confirm success when you have broken in, for whatever may be the discipline of the troops, it is impossible that confusion and intermingling of units can be avoided." In this case the distance between the lines should have been very much increased, and the second and third lines should not have closed in until they were needed to reinforce the first. This great attack was almost a complete success; and the cause of its ultimate defeat was that in the excitement of the attack the second and third lines, instead of keeping their respective distances, closed in upon the first. The 13th of May was comparatively a day of rest. Although the great assault had failed, it had come so near success that Grant was determined to make another effort. A movement by his left promised an opportunity of attacking Lee's right before it could be reinforced or its intrenchments extended. The moon was young, the night foggy, rainy, and intensely dark. Warren and Wright were ordered to march by country roads, passing in the rear of Hancock and Burnside, cross the Ny, move through fields to the Fredericksburg road, on it recross the Ny, form on Burnside's left, and attack the Confederate right flank at 4 A.M. on the 14th. Hancock and Burnside were to be ready, when ordered, to join in the attack. Again Grant had the worst of luck. During the night the rain fell in torrents; the bonfires and the torches of the signalmen were put out; and the troops, over roads knee deep in mud, struggled wearily along at a very slow pace, and with many halts. When day broke, only Warren with 4,000 men had arrived at the appointed place. The other columns were so strung out in the rear, and so scattered, the men so exhausted, that the attack had to be abandoned. "We doubtless had a narrow escape from serious trouble," writes General Alexander. "With ordinary weather the distance was not great, and both the Fifth and Sixth Corps could have surprised our flank at dawn in the morning. Our intrenchments on that flank did not extend much beyond the court house." During the next 3 days, Grant remained in position opposite Lee's right, resting his men and receiving reinforcements. He ordered strong defensive lines built, which could be held by a reduced force, with the idea of concentrating again for another effort to carry the Confederate line at the salient, where he had been checked on the 12th. By the 17th, the works were strong enough to be held by Warren with the Fifth Corps. That night Hancock and Wright were ordered to pass around Burnside, and the Second, Sixth, and Ninth Corps to attack in conjunction at dawn, while the Fifth Corps (Warren) cooperated on the left. The plan seemed to promise well, but the attack was an entire failure. The infantry was slow in finding its way through the woods, and it was 8 o'clock before the troops came in sight of the Confederate lines. The divisions of Gibbon and Barlow, which had taken part in the assault on the 12th, led the way in lines of brigades, a much more effective formation than that employed before. This time the Confederate guns were in position, and their fire was concentrated on the infantry. Only a few men reached the enemy's line, and none penetrated it. About 10 o'clock Meade ordered the attack discontinued and the men withdrawn. At noon on the 19th, Grant issued orders for Hancock to move that night on the road to Richmond. Lee had anticipated this movement, and had ordered Ewell to make a reconnaissance in force. By a circuitous route Ewell took his men far around the enemy's flank, and got his entire corps of 6,000 troops in the rear of the Federals. Here he occupied a very critical position. He succeeded, however, in holding off the enemy until darkness covered his withdrawal. In this venture he lost 900 men, or about 15% of his force. This ended the battle of Spotsylvania, in which the losses on both sides were very heavy. Grant's casualties were 2,725 killed, and 13,416 wounded, a total of 16,141. His total loss since the beginning of the campaign had been in excess of 33,000. The Confederate losses, from the Wilderness to the close of the war, can never be accurately known, as few reports were made. Livermore estimates their losses for these two battles at 17,250, the missing not included. Grant now tried a new manoeuvre. On the night of the 20th of May he started Hancock for Guiney Station, about 10 miles east of Spotsylvania, with orders to march from that point south toward Hanover Court House. He hoped that Lee would move against his corps with the bulk of his army, and thus afford a chance of striking the Confederates in the open country before they had time to entrench. At this time Sheridan was absent with most of the Union cavalry. After the battle of the Wilderness, Grant had sent him on a raid around the left of the Confederate army, with orders to attack Lee's cavalry, cut the Virginia Central and Fredericksburg railways, and do all the damage he could. Stuart followed him, as Grant had expected, and finally succeeded in placing his command across Sheridan's path at Yellow Tavern, only 6 miles north of Richmond. In the severe combat which followed, Stuart was mortally wounded, and his command defeated. Sheridan then passed close to the city, but was not strong enough to attack the works. He had a narrow escape from capture, but finally reached the James River, where he secured rations and forage from Butler. He then returned by way of White House, and rejoined the army on the 24th of May near Chesterfield, having ridden entirely around Lee's army. This was only one more of those useless and perilous cavalry raids so common during the Civil War. It had no material effect on the campaign, and deprived Grant of the "eyes and ears" of his army at a critical moment. All of the cavalry that was left with the army was sent with Hancock under the command of Torbert. The Union movement was observed and hindered by the Confederate horsemen under Wade Hampton. On the morning of the 21st, Warren started by the same route taken by Hancock, and was followed later by Burnside and Wright. Lee did not feel strong enough to assume the offensive, and therefore failed to fall into Grant's trap. As soon as he learned of the Federal movement he ordered Ewell to march directly for Hanover Junction, and followed with his whole army. Although Hancock had a start of 12 hours, on account of his long detour he did not arrive until after Lee. He found the Confederates drawn up behind the North Anna River, covering Richmond and the Virginia Central Railway. There were 2 bridges opposite their right, a ford in front of their center, and another ford 2½ miles distant, beyond their left. The line first held by Lee was dangerously extended, but he now executed a peculiar manoeuvre. He shut up his line as one closes an umbrella. The line originally had been almost straight. It now assumed a triangular form, with the apex on the river. His whole army was then massed in a space not more than 2½ miles broad. He could reinforce any point attacked in much shorter time than Grant could concentrate at the same point. At this time Lee was rejoined by Pickett's division, some 5,000 strong, and he received other reinforcements aggregating about 4,000 more, or a total of 9,000 fresh troops. Grant formed his line in front of Lee's position, with the 5th and 6th Corps on the right, the 2nd and part of the 9th on the left. The 2 wings were unable to communicate without crossing the river twice. Lee's position was so strong that it defeated its object, as Grant did not venture to attack. Lee was anxious to take advantage of his reinforcements to strike a blow, But the Federal entrenchments were very strong, and the flat open country gave full play to their artillery. Besides, Lee at this time was confined to his tent by a temporary illness, so neither side made any serious attack. On the night of the 26th, Grant removed the temptation, ere Lee had recovered, by moving for the Pamunkey. After dark on the 26th, Grant set his army in motion for Hanovertown, near which he crossed the Pamunkey River. Sheridan's cavalry, which had just rejoined the army, led the way. At Hawes' Shop, south of the river, it defeated the Confederate cavalry, under Wade Hampton, in a fierce combat which lasted all day. As soon as Lee discovered, on the morning of the 27th, that the Federals had vanished, he marched by way of Half Sink to the Totopotomoy, which he reached the next day in time to see the Union army just arriving on the opposite bank. As he moved by interior lines about 6 miles shorter than the route taken by Grant, he won the race, as usual. The Confederates immediately entrenched their position so strongly that Grant decided not to assault. After leaving Spotsylvania Court House, the armies found themselves in a rich farming country entirely different from the wilderness. The farther south and east they marched, the broader and deeper they found the streams, the lower, flatter, and more marshy the land. Grant once more moved by the left flank. Lee followed, and the two armies found themselves at Cold Harbor. In order to understand the strategic importance of this point, it is necessary to give a brief description of the country near it. Hanovertown, where the Union army was concentrated south of the Pamunkey, is about 17 miles in a straight line northeast of Richmond. The theater is traversed by two rivers, Totopotomoy Creek, running easterly into the Pamunkey, and the Chickahominy River, flowing southeasterly to the James. Between these there are a number of smaller streams with low banks, their borders swampy and covered with woods and thickets. From Hanovertown 3 main roads lead to Richmond: the Shady Grove, the Mechanicsville, and the Cold Harbor, which runs via Old and New Cold Harbor and Gaines' Mill. New Cold Harbor was little more than the intersection of crossroads, but Old Cold Harbor, 1.5 miles east, and about midway between Hanovertown and Richmond, was an important strategic point, because it commanded the roads running south toward the James, and northeast toward White House, the President Union base. At Cold Harbor, Grant was joined by W. F. Smith with about 10,000 men of the 10th and 18th Corps from Butler's army, and Lee was further reinforced by Hoke's division of 5,000 men from Drury's Bluff. Lee immediately began to work southward, by extending his right flank so as to secure Old Cold Harbor, and command the roads above described. On the 31st of May, this important strategic point was seized by Sheridan's cavalry, which entrenched, and held the position until relieved by Wright's corps. Several desperate attacks by the Confederates on the following day were all successfully repelled. The Union losses were nearly 2,000, and the enemy probably suffered to about the same extent. On the 3rd of June, Grant assaulted Lee's strongly entrenched position, and in 1 hour lost nearly 6,000 men, killed and wounded. On this occasion Grant seems to have lost his head, and he regretted this useless slaughter to the last day of his life. There was no manoeuvring as there had been at Spotsylvania. There was no massing against any particular point. The order was given for the whole line to attack, and the army moved straight against the enemy's front. Swinton is responsible for the statement, repeated by many other historians, that Grant ordered the attack renewed, but the men refused to advance. They knew that the position could not be taken. This is absolutely denied by General Alexander, who was present at the battle. He says, "No such silent defiance of orders occurred, or anything like it." Cold Harbor was only 6 miles from the outer works around Richmond, and the right of Lee's line was within 3 miles of those works. If Grant could have broken the Confederate center at Cold Harbor, he might have destroyed Lee's army, captured Richmond, and ended the war at one stroke. As early as the 26th of May, Grant had taken steps to be prepared to cross the James, with a view of attacking Richmond and Petersburg from the south side. He ordered his engineers to collect material for making bridges, and telegraphed Halleck at Washington to forward to City Point all the pontoons on hand. The Union army remained in front of Lee's position until the night of the 12th of June, when Grant set his troops in motion to cross the James River. This ended the great campaign of the Wilderness. The Union losses during the first 12 days of June totaled 1,905 killed, and 10,570 wounded; in all, 12,475. The Confederate losses are not known, but were certainly smaller. Grant began the campaign with 105,000 men, and received over 45,000 reinforcements. During the campaign he lost 55,000 men. Lee began with 62,000, and received about 14,000 reinforcements. His losses, as already stated, are unknown, but were probably under 20,000. The student will look in vain for anything brilliant in the way of strategy or tactics in Grant's campaign from the Rapidan to the James. His successive turning operations all failed of their object, to get between Lee's army and Richmond, and cut his communications. At every move he found Lee entrenched across his path. At the end of 6 weeks he found himself on the James, where he might have transported his army in the first place without losing a man. Nor were his tactics any better. He seems to have had no plan of attack in any of his battles. At Spotsylvania he assaulted first one part of the Confederate lines and then another. He wore his troops out in marches and countermarches. Orders were issued and countermanded. Corps were sent to places only to be recalled. The one outstanding feature of the campaign is Grant's tenacity of purpose, his determination "to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." He never seemed to know when he was getting the worst of it. The tenor of all his dispatches was to the effect that the enemy was suffering more than his own army. To a deputation of influential politicians who recommended Grant's removal from command, President Lincoln replied, "I like that man. He fights." "If, as the mediaeval chroniclers tell us," writes General Law, "Charles Martel, the Hammerer, gained that title by a 7 days' continuous battle with the Saracens at Tours, General Grant certainly entitled himself to a like distinction by his 30 days' campaign from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor." In these words of General Law we find outlined the great distinction between generals of the two definite types of McClellan and Grant. The former never could make up his mind to fight; the latter well deserved his appellation of "the Hammerer." Like Napoleon, he never hesitated to make sacrifices if necessary, in order to achieve victory. Reference has already been made in these pages to the analogy between war and chess. Some commanders, like some chess masters, never attain great success, because, having too great a regard for their materiel, they refuse to part with it. It should always be remembered that men are only the pieces in the game, the means to an end, and as such they should be made subservient to the purpose in view, namely, victory. Therefore, the great general, like the chess master, must ever be prepared for sacrifices. Napoleon is reported to have said, "What are 1,000,000 men to me?" This remark, if ever made, was not so brutal as it sounds. All that he meant to convey was that, to achieve victory, he never hesitated to press home his attack, no matter how great his losses. "The ardent desire for the fight," writes Colonel Vacher, "was a new and characteristic trait of his genius, for how many generals in chief hesitate the moment they enter upon that terrible drama which is played at the cost of so many human lives, and on which there so often depends the fate of empires and nations." At St. Helena, Napoleon also remarked that it was rare to find generals who were in a hurry to give battle. They carefully took up their positions, and thought out their combinations, but they could not make up their minds to attack. The campaign was marked by the number of turning movements, the frequent night marches, and the changes of the base of supplies. As the army advanced, the base was shifted from the Orange and Alexandria Railway to Aquia Creek, then to Port Royal, next to White House, and finally to the James River. The most marked feature of the Wilderness campaign, however, was the general use of intrenchments. As soon as the troops were halted, the men threw up shelter without waiting for the officers to give the order. In this wooded country it was an easy matter to construct entrenchments, and they were strong enough for the purpose. There were a great many expert axemen in both armies, and trees were soon felled, or the fallen timber gathered. A pile of logs and branches made a good foundation, over these the men threw a little earth, and a breastwork was soon constructed that was bullet proof at least. General Alexander says that the Confederate equipment with entrenching tools was very poor. The men habitually loosened the ground with bayonets and scooped it up with tin cups. Their line was generally laid out by those who built it. The Federals, on the other hand, had a force of perhaps 2,500 men, of engineer troops and heavy artillery regiments, habitually employed for this work under the direction of engineer officers. This use of entrenchments was copied by both the hostile armies during the Great War, and carried to an extent never before known. In summing up his interesting and valuable study of the Wilderness Campaign, Colonel Henderson says: "For those who care to study the campaign closely, it is worth while noting with what skill Lee's positions were selected. His flanks at Spotsylvania, at the North Anna, and at Cold Harbor, were so secured by streams that it was very difficult indeed for his opponent to manoeuvre without crossing one of these streams, and so dividing his army. It was not only the entrenchments, but the natural features of the ground also, on which Lee relied in his defensive tactics. His eye for ground must have been extraordinary." CHAPter 18 May to September, 1864 Atlanta. The Confederates were not actively pursued after the battle of Chattanooga. Bragg therefore halted at Dalton, only 25 miles from the field of his defeat, and entrenched his army. He was then relieved of the command at his own request; but President Davis showed continued confidence in his ability by calling him to Richmond as chief of staff. He was ordered to turn over the command to the senior Lieutenant General Hardee, who might have retained the position if he had not shrunk from the responsibility. At this time there were but 5 officers of the full rank of general in the Confederate service, of whom the only 2 available were Johnston and Beauregard. General Lee suggested the name of the latter for the chief command in the West, but Mr. Davis did not take kindly to the idea. While the matter was under discussion, General Polk wrote to the President a strong letter urging the appointment of Joseph P. Johnston. Mr. Davis, who was not on very friendly terms with either Beauregard or Johnston, was placed in a very embarrassing position, but finally decided to appoint the latter. On the 16th of December Johnston was ordered to turn over the command of the Army of the Mississippi to Polk, and proceed to Dalton to take command of the Army of the Tennessee. The Richmond authorities were in favor of a prompt renewal of the aggressive, with a view to the recovery of Tennessee. Both Mr. Seddon, the Secretary of War, and President Davis wrote Johnston the last of December, urging him to assume the offensive as soon as the condition of his army would allow it. In his reply on the 2d of January, Johnston presented the difficulties in the way of action. "I can see no other mode of taking the offensive here," he wrote Mr. Davis, "than to beat the enemy when he advances, and then move forward." The correspondence continued throughout the winter, and Mr. Davis, by making it personal, evinced a desire to overlook former differences. But General Johnston's tone remained that of cold formality, and he showed no disposition to meet the views of the President. Finally, about the 1st of March, Mr. Davis dropped the correspondence, turning it over to General Bragg. The situation was one which called for prompt action. During the winter, the Federal forces in the West were much dispersed, and a quick blow at Thomas, at Chattanooga, would have found him isolated. Schofield was at Knoxville, over 100 miles to the northeast. Logan, with part of Sherman's forces, was near Huntsville, an equal distance to the southwest; and the rest of Sherman's command was on the Meridian expedition, or returning to Vicksburg. To wait for spring was to wait for the Federals to concentrate their now scattered armies, and be fully prepared for the campaign. It is no wonder that the Richmond government lost patience with Johnston's attitude. Lee, who had been in Richmond, was in full accord with this plan, and wrote Longstreet, who had not yet rejoined him after the Chattanooga campaign, urging him to cooperate in influencing Johnston to adopt it. "If you and Johnston could unite and move into Middle Tennessee," he said, "it would cut the armies of Chattanooga and Knoxville in two, and draw them from those points where either portion could be struck at as occasion offered." It cannot be denied, as General Cox states, that this plan was based on sound strategy. Both Grant and Sheridan were glad that they were allowed to complete their preparations, and were not called upon to meet the enemy before they were ready. Johnston's abilities are undoubted, and later he conducted his defensive campaign with great skill, but he lacked the audacity of Lee and Stonewall Jackson, which so often won victories for the Confederates. Hood, who had been assigned to a corps in Johnston's army, wrote Mr. Davis on the 7th of March that the army was well prepared, in high spirits, and anxious for battle. He strongly supported the plan of moving before Grant could concentrate. As requested by Lee, Longstreet wrote Johnston on the 5th of March to the effect that he was ready to join in the movement. A week later, Bragg wrote from Richmond, outlining the plan of campaign mentioned above, and saying that on receiving the assurance of its immediate execution, Johnston would be reinforced so as to have an army of at least 75,000 men. In his replies, Johnston pronounced the plan impracticable, and again argued that it was better to let the enemy's forces advance, and fight them far from their base and near his own. There were certainly very sound arguments in favor of his position. The principal Union depot for operations in Alabama and Georgia was Nashville, centrally located as the capital of Tennessee, but 186 miles by rail south of the Ohio River. It was directly connected with Chattanooga by 150 miles of railroad, and indirectly by a line 35 miles longer by way of Decatur and Stevenson. It had the further advantage of water connection with the Ohio by the Cumberland River. A railroad had also recently been completed, some 70 miles in length, from Nashville to Johnsonville on the Tennessee, a much larger river, nearly parallel to the Cumberland in this part of its course. With these great lines of communication, the problem of supplying the army seemed to be solved. So much trouble had been experienced, however, in earlier campaigns, from the interruption of railway service by Confederate raids, that special means had been devised to protect the lines. Every wooden bridge across a stream was a vulnerable point, and a system of blockhouses had been developed to guard all the bridges. 10 tons made a load for the small freight cars of that day, and with the iron rails and light locomotives, 20 to 30 cars made a full train. As Sherman estimated that he must receive at the front 150 carloads daily, it is easy to understand the difficulty of supplying an army far from its base. The work of the railways had also to be supplemented by the wagon trains necessary in the field to carry the baggage of the army, its ammunition, and a few days' rations. The amount of food and forage required by a large army has already been referred to, in connection with Grant's first advance on Vicksburg. It makes in the aggregate a bulk and weight astonishing to those who are not familiar with the subject. Great droves of beef cattle also accompanied the army, and the driving, feeding, and distribution of these made of itself no small task. After some further correspondence, the subject of the Confederate offensive in the West was dropped by the Richmond government. It was now known that Grant would not personally lead the Western army, but would turn over his command to Sherman. Concentration on both sides was the order of the day, and Longstreet was directed to rejoin Lee. As Johnston had not accepted the aggressive plan suggested, he was notified that he could not expect the reinforcement promised him on that condition. Polk was ordered to join him, and he also received about 4,000 men from Mobile. All the troops that Beauregard could spare, and that could be withdrawn from the Atlantic coast, were sent to Lee. "The very unsatisfactory relations between Mr. Davis and General Johnston," says General Cox, "cannot be overlooked, if we would judge intelligently the events of the Atlanta campaign." Johnston may have been right in thinking a winter campaign impracticable, but he should have carried out the wishes of his government, or resigned in time to let another undertake the task. Little had been done by the Federal forces in the West during the winter. Grant remained in command until March, when he went East to assume his position of Lieutenant General and Commander in Chief of all the armies. He was succeeded by General Sherman in Tennessee. It was impossible for Sherman to assume the offensive against Johnston before the 1st of May, due to the bad condition of the roads in the early spring, the necessity of accumulating supplies, and the depletion of his ranks through the so called Veteran Act. Prior to the opening of the campaign some changes were made in the organization of Sherman's army. The 20th Corps was formed by the consolidation of the 11th and 12th, and placed under the command of Hooker; and Howard replaced Gordon Granger in command of the 4th Corps. The Army of the Tennessee, consisting of the 15th, 17th, and part of the 16th Corps, was assigned to McPherson. Burnside was succeeded by Schofield in command of the Army of the Ohio, consisting only of the 23rd Corps. Thomas remained in command of the Army of the Cumberland, made up of the 4th, 14th, and 20th Corps. As will appear later, several changes were made in these commands during the campaign. The returns for the 30th of April, 1864, show Sherman's strength to have been about 110,000 men. After making all deductions for the garrisons of Nashville and Chattanooga, and the numerous small posts and blockhouses, he was able to take the field with nearly 100,000 troops. Note: A map of the Atlanta campaign can be found on page 371. At the opening of the campaign his forces were distributed as follows: Army of the Ohio, Schofield, near Red Clay, on the railway 13 miles north of Dalton, 13,559 men. Army of the Tennessee, McPherson, at Lee and Gordon's Mill, 20 miles northwest of Dalton, 24,465 men. Army of the Cumberland, Thomas, near Ringgold, on the railway 12 miles northwest of Dalton, 60,773. The front from Red Clay to Lee and Gordon's Mill in Chickamauga Valley was 20 miles long. Similar returns for Johnston's army at the end of April show that he had actually present at Dalton about 53,000 men. He was soon reinforced by Polk with 14,000, and a few detachments amounting to some 5,000 more, giving him an aggregate of 75,000 men soon after the opening of the campaign. Grant's instructions to Sherman, given in his confidential letter of the 4th of April, were to move against Johnston's army, to break it up, and to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as he could, inflicting all the damage possible against their war resources. Sherman's first objective, therefore, was Johnston's army, and the second, his base at Atlanta, 85 miles from Dalton. In his Memoirs, General Sherman says: Atlanta was known as the gate city of the South, was full of foundries, arsenals, and machine shops, and I knew that its capture would be the death knell of the Southern Confederacy. It was a large town of great strategic importance, the junction of railways leading to Chattanooga, Richmond, the Atlantic coast, and Montgomery, Alabama. The country between Chattanooga and Atlanta was generally rugged and hilly and covered with forests. Johnston's position at Dalton was protected in front by a ridge running north and south, some 30 miles long, which could be crossed by an army at two places only: the Gap, traversed by the railway, and Snake Creek Gap, 14 miles farther south. Sherman's advance began on the 7th of May. Finding Johnston's position too strong to attack in front, Sherman sent McPherson to turn it by way of Villanow and Snake Creek Gap. Thomas was ordered to support him by making a strong demonstration against Johnston's front. McPherson encountered a Confederate cavalry brigade about to occupy Snake Creek Gap, and routed it. On the afternoon of the 9th he was in front of Resaca, but considered the position too strong to assault. He therefore returned to the southern end of the Gap, and there took up a strong position. Leaving Howard, with Stoneman's cavalry division, to guard his line of communication, Sherman now moved the rest of his army to Snake Creek Gap, where, on the 12th, he concentrated his forces at McPherson's position. As Sherman's first objective was Johnston's army, he did not undertake these flanking movements merely to compel the enemy to retreat and yield more territory. His constant desire was to force conclusions as near his own base as possible. But, unlike Grant, he was too wise to wreck his army in frontal attacks against impregnable positions. Says Cox: "It was with an unwillingness growing at times into impatience that he found himself compelled to follow Johnston's slow and skillful retreat. It was not till the change of the Confederate commanders that aggressive tactics on the part of the enemy gave the opportunity for severe punishment, and led to the speedy destruction of the hostile army. Herein lies the key of the whole campaign. On the morning of the 13th of May, Johnston withdrew his army to Resaca, where he was joined by Polk's corps. He took up a strong position behind entrenchments on an irregular curve, covering the town, the bridges, and the railway. His right and left flanks were protected by the two rivers. On the morning of the 14th, Sherman's advance was renewed, guided as before by the Army of the Tennessee on the right, and continuing the wheeling movement toward the east. The army was deployed in front of Resaca, and demonstrations were made against the enemy's front and right. At the same time Sherman sent a division of infantry and Kilpatrick's cavalry to cross the Oostenaula by pontoon bridge at Ley's Ferry, 5 miles southwest of Resaca; and Garrard's cavalry division was dispatched from Villanow by way of Rome, to destroy the railroad between Calhoun and Kingston. These operations forced Johnston to withdraw from Resaca. Burning the railway bridge behind him, on the night of the 15th, he began his retreat to Adairsville, where he arrived on the 17th. Here he was joined by a force of 3,700 cavalry under W. H. Jackson. On the 16th Sherman took up the pursuit. The right under McPherson advanced by way of Ley's Ferry; Thomas in the center followed the railway; the left under Schofield crossed the river a few miles east of Resaca. One division, Davis's, of the 14th Corps, was sent to the support of Garrard's cavalry in the capture of Rome. This town was important on account of the Confederate iron works and machine shops, as well as the large stores collected there. The Union army was now in the most open district of northern Georgia, and Sherman was eager to bring the enemy to battle in this territory, where his superior numbers would have a better chance of winning a decisive victory. He therefore pressed the advance of his columns. On the afternoon of the 17th, Johnston selected a position for battle just north of Adairsville. Orders were given for the cavalry, strongly supported by infantry, to hold back Sherman's advance guard until the deployment should be completed. The Confederate line was to be extended across the valley in which the railway ran, with the flanks upon the heights on either side. But, upon testing the position by a partial deployment, Johnston concluded that his army was not large enough to fill it, and he resumed his retreat on Cassville and Kingston. These two places were about 7 miles apart. Johnston took the Kingston road with Hardee's corps, and the corps of Polk and Hood followed the route to Cassville. Johnston hoped that Sherman's columns would be so separated that he could concentrate upon one of them, and so fight his adversary in detail. The two hostile armies were now marching with wider fronts than at any time before; but the Federal flanks were farther apart than those of the Confederates. The position on the hills behind the village of Cassville was so strong that Johnston decided to make a stand there and accept battle. He announced his purpose in an unusually formal manner by issuing a brief but stirring address to his troops. His plan was to have Polk's corps make a stand on the Cassville road, while Hardee guarded the flank toward Kingston, and Hood fell upon the left of Schofield, as the latter deployed to attack Polk. But when the Union left crossed Two Run Creek and partly turned the right of the Confederate position, Hood and Polk became so uneasy that they protested against accepting battle there, and persuaded Johnston to continue his retreat through Cartersville across the Etowah River. Johnston always felt that he lost a great opportunity, and never ceased to regret it. The relations of General Johnston with the Richmond government had been strained since the beginning of the campaign, and his continued retreat had brought matters almost to the breaking point. Even a defeat at this time would have been better than a sudden withdrawal in the night, after he had so loudly proclaimed his intention of leading his men to battle. "Either the order has been an error," says General Cox, "or the retreat was one." Nothing is more destructive of the morale of an army than vacillation. On the 20th of May, Johnston took up a position at Allatoona Pass, which Sherman decided not to attempt to assail in front. After giving his army 3 days of rest, Sherman therefore set out on the 23d to turn the position. As the army would be separated from the railway, supplies for 20 days were carried in the wagons. 3 cavalry divisions covered the 2 flanks and the rear of the army, and the 4th cleared the front for the Union center. Sherman's general plan was to advance in several columns on Dallas, and from there on Marietta. Finding that his position at Allatoona was about to be turned, Johnston at once put his army in motion. His left under Hardee marched to Dallas, and took position south of the town, covering the main road to Atlanta, and extending northeast toward New Hope Church. Hood held the right at the church, and Polk was in the center upon the main road from Allatoona. Sherman's advance column, under Hooker, vigorously attacked Hood's corps at New Hope Church, and the fighting lasted from about 4 o'clock in the afternoon until ended by the fall of night. The Union army was now shifted to the left, and on the 6th of June was again across the railroad at Ackworth. In the new line the order of the armies was reversed, Schofield holding the right, and McPherson the left, with Thomas still in the center. The base was moved to Allatoona. In the meantime, Johnston had extended his line to the right until it reached from Lost Mountain to Brush Mountain, a distance of about 12 miles. Pine Mountain, an isolated hill in front of this line, was also occupied at first. Hardee's corps was still on the left, Polk's in the center, and Hood's on the right. The cavalry, under Wheeler and Jackson, guarded the 2 flanks. The position covered Marietta, the railway back to Atlanta, and the bridges on Johnston's line of retreat. On the 11th, the Union line was advanced close to that of the Confederates, and on the 14th Thomas deployed before Pine Mountain. On that day, while General Johnston, with Polk and Hardee, was reconnoitering on the mountain, Polk was struck and instantly killed by a shell from a Union battery. Loring succeeded to the command of his corps. That night the Confederate line was withdrawn from Pine Mountain. Between the 16th and the 19th, the Federals continued to press the Confederate lines, and Johnston drew in his forces nearer to Marietta. His line now extended along the crest of Kenesaw Mountain from end to end, and the Federals were close up to the Confederate trenches. Since the 1st of June it had rained continuously, and the whole country was a quagmire. There were only dirt roads in this region, and these were soon destroyed by the heavy army wagons. This greatly hindered the operations. During the next few days there was considerable skirmishing between the 2 hostile lines, without any decisive result. Finally, on the 27th of June, Sherman departed for the first time from his fixed policy, and ordered an assault on Johnston's position on Kenesaw Mountain. The dense forest made any artillery preparation almost impossible, and the attack was one of infantry against unshaken earthworks. The assault was easily repulsed, with a Confederate loss of less than 500, while the Federal casualties are given as 2,164 in the official reports. The affairs at New Hope Church and Kenesaw Mountain convinced Sherman that it was impracticable to bring all his force to bear in this difficult country. He therefore returned his advance by the tedious flanking movements, in the hope that the time would come when the enemy could no longer afford to retreat, and must resort to aggressive tactics. Johnston continued to adhere to his patient and steady policy of defense, although he knew that his constant retreat was giving great dissatisfaction to the authorities at Richmond. He withdrew from one position to another, until he finally took up a line behind Peachtree Creek, to make a last stand for the defense of Atlanta. Meanwhile his relations with President Davis had reached a crisis, and on the evening of the 17th of July he received a telegram from Richmond, directing him to turn over the command of his army to Hood. This step was taken by President Davis with great reluctance, and under strong popular and political pressure. It was claimed that Johnson intended to surrender at Atlanta without giving battle. General Bragg was therefore sent from Richmond to interview him, and after spending 2 days at Atlanta, telegraphed: "He has not sought my advice, and it was not volunteered. I cannot learn that he has any more plan in the future than he has had in the past." Mr. Davis then telegraphed Johnston a direct inquiry: "I wish to hear from you as to present situation, and your plan of operations, so specifically as will enable me to anticipate events." This was sent on the 16th of July, and Johnston replied the same day as follows: "As the enemy has double our numbers, we must be on the defensive. My plan of operations must therefore depend upon that of the enemy. It is mainly to watch for an opportunity to fight to advantage. We are trying to put Atlanta into condition to be held for a day or two by the Georgia militia, that army movements may be freer and wider." This reply was certainly not specific, and was considered evasive. On the 17th, Adjutant General Cooper telegraphed Johnston: "I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, far into the interior of Georgia, and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from the command of the army and the Department of the Tennessee, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood." To this Johnston replied that the order had been received and obeyed, and added: "As to the alleged cause of my removal, I assert that Sherman's army is much stronger compared with that of Tennessee, than Grant's compared with that of Northern Virginia. Yet the enemy has been compelled to advance much more slowly to the vicinity of Atlanta than to that of Richmond and Petersburg, and penetrated much deeper into Virginia than into Georgia. Confident language by a military commander is not usually regarded as evidence of competence." It must be admitted that there was much truth in this statement, but it did not go to the heart of the matter. Between Lee and his government there was always perfect frankness and a cordial understanding; so that in case of misfortune it was felt that he had done the best he could, under the circumstances. Johnston's advice to Hood showed that he only needed to be equally frank with the Richmond authorities. Had he been so, it is quite safe to say that he would not have been removed. The removal of General Johnston at this time has been generally condemned, and the result was certainly disastrous to the Confederate cause. A more favorable view of the action of President Davis, however, is expressed by General Cox. "It cannot be denied," he says, "that there was a certain justification for Mr. Davis's conclusion that the circumstances foreboded the yielding of Atlanta without the desperate struggle which the importance of the position demanded. Had Johnston expressed any hopefulness, or said, what was the fact, that he was himself coming to the determination to try the effect of a bold attack, whilst Sherman's army was in motion, he would probably have been left in command." Loring had already been succeeded by A. P. Stewart in command of Polk's old corps, and Cheatham now took the place of Hood. John B. Hood, a native of Kentucky, was just entering upon his 34th year. After graduating at West Point in 1853, in the same class with McPherson, Schofield, and Sheridan, he had seen active service fighting the Indians on the frontier, after which he was for some time a cavalry instructor at the Military Academy. He entered the Confederate army at the outbreak of the Civil War, and fought in most of the Virginia battles, during the first 2 years. He was severely wounded at Gettysburg, losing the use of one arm. Going west with Longstreet, he fought bravely at Chickamauga, where he lost a leg. From Dalton to Atlanta he commanded a corps with the rank of lieutenant general, and now on his promotion to the command of the army, he received the provisional grade of a full general. In his Memoirs, General Sherman says that "Hood, though not deemed much of a scholar, or of a great mental capacity, was undoubtedly a brave, determined, and rash man." On the evening of the 19th of July, the Union right under Thomas, and the center under Schofield, were in the act of crossing Peach Tree Creek at 2 different points, while the left under McPherson was near Decatur. The flanks of the army were fully 10 miles apart, and there was a wide interval between Thomas and Schofield. Johnston had expected to attack Sherman's army while it was divided in crossing this difficult stream, and he magnanimously explained his plans to Hood. In reading his statement, one cannot help thinking how unfortunate for him it was that he did not state his plans to Mr. Davis as fully as he gave them to Hood. Pursuant to this plan, on the afternoon of the 20th, Hood attacked Thomas in flank, while Cheatham held off Schofield and McPherson. The Confederate movement was well concealed by the dense woods up to the moment of the onset; but the assault was repulsed by Thomas. This was the battle of Peach Tree Creek. On the 22nd, the second part of Johnston's plan was tried. While Cheatham advanced from the Atlanta lines, and resumed the assaults upon McPherson and Schofield, Hardee's corps made a long night march to a position south of Decatur, and fell upon McPherson's flank. A great battle was fought along a front of 5 miles, but the Confederates were repulsed at every point, and forced to retire within the defenses of the city. The brave McPherson was killed on this day, and Howard succeeded him in the command of the Army of the Tennessee. On the 28th, as Howard was marching from the left wing to the right, to extend the Union lines southward on the west side of Atlanta, Hood fiercely attacked the Federal flank at Ezra Church, but was again repulsed. In these 3 battles around Atlanta the Confederate losses were about 15,000, while the Federal casualties were only 6,000. It was only a week since Johnston had been relieved, and the Confederate troops were so discouraged that for the first time in the Civil War they refused to continue the assaults. It was generally understood on both sides that a change of commanders meant the adoption of an aggressive policy on the part of the Confederates, but no one expected that it would so soon result in the ruin of their cause. At the time of his succession to the command, Hood claimed that his army numbered less than 50,000 effectives. Thus, in less than 10 days, his tactics had resulted in the loss of 30% of his command. At this time there were several more changes in the general officers of both armies. On the 26th of July, Stephen D. Lee succeeded Cheatham in command of Hood's old corps. Hooker, who ranked Howard, resigned in disgust when the latter was promoted to succeed McPherson, and Slocum was assigned to the 20th Corps. Palmer also, a little later, took offense at being ordered to serve under Schofield, whom he claimed to rank, and gave up the command of the 14th Corps. He was succeeded by Jeff. C. Davis. At the end of July, Sherman was awaiting the result of several attempts with his cavalry to cut Hood's communications. These operations all failed, and he states in his Memoirs, "I now became satisfied that nothing would suffice but for us to reach it (the railroad below Atlanta) with the main army." In furtherance of this plan, during the first 3 weeks of August, the Union line was extended to the west and south of Atlanta. In the meantime, Wheeler had raided the Union communications as far back as Dalton, and done considerable damage. Taking advantage of Wheeler's absence, Sherman sent Kilpatrick to try once more to cut Hood's communications. The Union cavalry made a complete circuit of Atlanta, took some prisoners, and destroyed a few miles of railway, but in a day or 2 the damage was all repaired. Sherman therefore returned to his plan of a movement with his whole army. Accordingly, rations for 15 days were issued to the army, and the movement began on the 25th of August. On the 31st, Hardee, with about half the Confederate army, made a fierce attack on the Union lines, but was repulsed. The following day, Hood evacuated Atlanta, and concentrated his army at Lovejoy Station. Sherman then occupied the city to rest and prepare for further operations. Thomas was stationed at Atlanta, Howard at East Point, and Schofield at Decatur. The cavalry covered the flanks and rear from Roswell to Sandtown. The Atlanta campaign was at an end. According to the return of his army for the 30th of April, 1864, on file in the War Department, General Johnston had "present for duty" about 53,000 men. Between that date and the 10th of June he received reinforcements to the number of 32,000 men. His army reached its maximum strength at New Hope Church, where he had about 75,000 troops in line. At that same time General Sherman's army numbered about 93,000 men, of all arms. The odds against Johnston, therefore, were not so great as frequently stated. The losses on both sides during the campaign were approximately: Federals killed, 4,423; Confederates, 3,044. Federals wounded, 22,822; Confederates, 18,952. Missing Federals, 4,442; and missing Confederates, 12,983. Total losses for the Federals, 31,687; for the Confederates, 34,979. "High as was the national estimate of the importance of Sherman's campaign," says General Cox, "Southern men rated it and its consequences quite as high as we did. When the city fell, the whole South as well as the North knew that a decisive step had been taken toward the defeat of the rebellion." The campaign began on the 7th of May and ended with Hood's evacuation of Atlanta. In less than 4 months, almost entirely by skillful manoeuvres, Sherman had forced the Confederate army back about 90 miles, and reached his goal. In the same length of time, Grant had forced Lee back from the Rapidan to the lines in front of Petersburg, but he did not capture Richmond until the following April. In both campaigns the opposing forces were practically the same: 100,000 Federals and 60,000 Confederates. The difference between Grant's tactics of "hammering" and Sherman's of "manoeuvring" is shown by the list of casualties. Grant had lost over 50,000 men, while Sherman had lost less than 30,000. Both campaigns were made in very difficult country. Sherman's campaign has been highly praised by both American and European critics, and little fault can be found with his strategy. His greatest mistake was the unnecessary and costly assault of Kenesaw Mountain. His excuse was, that the army was tired of marching over the muddy roads and wanted to fight. The assault was tactically well made, but the position proved too strong. Sherman seems to have missed a good opportunity to strike the Confederate army a decisive blow during Hood's withdrawal from Atlanta, when he had to make a flank march by the heads of the 3 Union armies. Hood himself expressed surprise that he was allowed to do so unmolested. If Johnston had not been relieved of command, he might have held Atlanta for as many months as Lee kept Grant at bay in front of Petersburg. But Hood, both by his natural disposition and the force of circumstances, was committed from the first to an aggressive policy, which speedily proved ruinous. He blamed his failure in the attacks of the 20th and 22d to one of his corps commanders, General Hardee. But General Alexander states that it was due largely to his own neglect to supervise the execution of important orders, a sort of failure from which even the most eminent commanders have never been exempt. As in many other campaigns, the use of the cavalry in "raids" proved an amusement that was very costly to both sides. General Cox well remarks that "the game was never worth the candle." Both armies in this campaign made constant use of field works. "Except in attacking the Kenesaw Mountain," says Hamley, "the character of Sherman's operations was throughout the same. To protect his main line from a counter attack, he left a force entrenched across it. He then reinforced his flanking wing to a strength sufficient to cope with the whole army of the enemy, and directed it, by a circuit of the main line, upon the Confederate rear. In every case the operation was successful, obliging Johnston forthwith to abandon his strongest positions and to retreat. "No officer or soldier who ever served under me," writes General Sherman, "will question the generalship of Joseph E. Johnston. His retreats were timely, in good order, and he left nothing behind." Chapter 19. September, 1864 to April, 1865. Nashville. Following the occupation of Atlanta, there were no further military operations for a period of several weeks. Logan and Blair went home to look after politics, and many of the regiments claimed the discharge to which they were entitled by reason of the expiration of their terms of service. The whole army, officers and men alike, seemed to relax more or less, and desire a rest after the fatigue of the 4 months' campaign. Although Sherman had attained his goal in taking Atlanta, he "had not accomplished all, for Hood's army, the chief objective, had escaped." The real trouble had only begun. The Confederate army, composed of veterans inured to war, and still 40,000 strong, was only 30 miles away, at Lovejoy's Station, on the railroad to Savannah. On the 21st September, Hood shifted his position to Palmetto Station, 25 miles southwest of Atlanta, and began preparations for an active campaign against Sherman's line of communications, to compel him to abandon Atlanta. At this time, Hood was visited by President Davis, who made his celebrated speech in which he predicted that his army would make Sherman's retreat more disastrous than that of Napoleon from Moscow. Forewarned, Sherman took immediate steps to thwart Hood's plans. Newton's division of the Fourth Corps, and Morgan's of the 14th, were sent back to Tennessee, and Corse's division of the 17th Corps was ordered to Rome. Thomas was dispatched to his headquarters at Nashville, and Schofield to his at Knoxville, while Sherman remained at Atlanta to await Hood's next move. Orders were given the Union commanders at Nashville, Decatur, and Chattanooga to take active measures to protect the railway. At this time Grant had Lee's army invested at Petersburg. Canby at New Orleans was preparing for an expedition against Mobile, in conjunction with Farragut's fleet; and a combined land and naval expedition was contemplated against Fort Fisher at the mouth of Cape Fear River, in North Carolina. On the 12th of September, General Grant wrote that he was in doubt as to the best plan for the use of the forces under Sherman's command. On the 20th, Sherman replied: "I should keep Hood employed, and put my army in fine order for a march on Augusta, Columbia, and Charleston; and start as soon as Wilmington is sealed to commerce, and the city of Savannah is in our possession." At this stage of the correspondence, Hood simplified the situation by taking the offensive, and threatening Sherman's long line of communications. On the 5th of October, he attacked the Union base at Allatoona, but was repulsed with heavy loss. Leaving one corps under Slocum to defend Atlanta, Sherman at once moved against Hood. A week later, Sherman was at Rome, while the Confederates captured Dalton with its garrison of 1,000 men. On the 15th, Sherman was back at Snake Creek Gap, where he had begun his campaign in May, and Hood was a few miles south of Lafayette. Here Hood intended to select a position and give battle, but he was deterred by his corps commander, who advised against it. Therefore, after resting 2 days at Cross Roads, he directed his march on Gadsden, where he concentrated his army on the 22d of October. In the meantime, General Beauregard had been placed in command of the military division of the West, which included Hood's army, and Cheatham had been assigned to the old corps of Hardee, whom Hood blamed for his defeats around Atlanta. Hood's far-reaching plans at this time, according to his own account, were to capture Nashville, and make it a base for a victorious campaign in Kentucky; then to move east, through some of the gaps in the Cumberland Mountains, and fall upon Grant's rear at Petersburg. After this, his army, combined with Lee's, might turn and rend Sherman, or march north and capture Washington. Sherman followed Hood as far as Galesville, where he halted to see what the Confederates would do next. After a short pause, Hood crossed the mountains to Decatur, which he avoided attacking, as it was well defended, and finally halted at Tuscumbia, opposite Florence, Alabama, on the Tennessee River. Sherman then sent 2 of his 6 corps by rail to Thomas at Nashville, and began his preparations for the march to the coast. Repairing the broken railroads, he collected at Atlanta all the supplies necessary for his expedition. On the 4th November, he had assembled 4 infantry corps, 1 cavalry division, and 65 field guns, an aggregate of about 60,000 men. While at Gadsden, Hood received a visit from Beauregard, to whom he unfolded his plan of campaign, which was formally approved. Beauregard stipulated, however, that Wheeler's cavalry should be detached to hang on Sherman's rear, but promised to send an order to Forrest to join Hood's army as soon as it crossed the Tennessee. Hood was detained 3 weeks at Tuscumbia, waiting for supplies, and for Forrest to come up. The cavalry was much impeded in its march by muddy roads and high water, and did not join Hood until the 18th of November. This delay proved to be the salvation of Nashville. Notwithstanding all the efforts of the Union authorities to reinforce Thomas, there were only about 30,000 Federal troops within the whole district when Hood reached the Tennessee River the last of October. The Union forces were scattered in detachments all the way from Chattanooga to the Ohio River, guarding the lines of communication. As the success of Sherman's movement was bound up with Thomas's ability to defeat Hood's plans, it would have been more prudent to send another corps to Nashville, and make the march to the sea with a smaller force. The forces which Sherman left behind for Thomas comprised the 4th Corps under Stanley, the 23d under Schofield, and about 5,000 cavalry under General Wilson, whom Grant had sent west from the Army of the Potomac, with the message, "I believe he will add 50% to the effectiveness of your cavalry." Thomas's force of 22,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry was entirely inadequate to cope with Hood's veteran army of 35,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry led by the redoubtable Forrest, whose maxim was that "success lies in getting there first with the most men." But Sherman had sent to Missouri for an additional corps of 14,000 men, commanded by General Andrew J. Smith, an able officer. It was hoped that Smith could leave St. Louis by the 10th of November, but he was busy driving Sterling Price out of the State, and this caused a delay of 2 weeks. He did not reach St. Louis until the 24th, and it was the last day of the month when he finally joined Thomas at Nashville. At the same time some 5,000 men, belonging to different organizations, who had been belated in rejoining, were sent from Chattanooga and formed into a provisional division under General Steedman. Other reinforcements from different points also joined about the 1st of December, so that on that date Thomas found himself at the head of a motley array of between 50 and 55,000 men. Hood's long delay at Tuscumbia, an accident upon which no one could have calculated, gave time for Thomas to concentrate his army, and saved the situation. This would seem to prove that Sherman was unwarranted in taking so large a part of his army for his military promenade, and leaving so slender a force to oppose Hood. Everything finally turned out all right, but Thomas had an anxious 4 weeks at Nashville after Sherman cut loose from Atlanta. Having finally obtained his supplies, and been joined by the larger part of his cavalry, on the 19th November, Hood crossed the river at Florence and began his northward march. Thomas was at Nashville, occupied with hurrying up his reinforcements, and the main body of the Union army, the 4th and 23d Corps, was at Pulaski, under the command of Schofield. Hood's army marched in 3 columns, Stewart's corps by the Lawrenceburg road, Cheatham's by the Waynesboro road, and Lee's by an intermediate road. Hood hoped to outflank Schofield's position at Pulaski, and cut off his retreat by seizing the bridge across Duck River at Columbia. On the 22nd, Stewart was at Lawrenceburg, 16 miles west of Pulaski. Schofield now realized that he had no time to lose, and at once set his troops in motion. By a forced march he reached Columbia just in time to prevent Forrest from seizing the bridge, and cutting off his line of retreat. As fast as the troops arrived, they were ordered to throw up earthworks to cover the approaches to the town from the south. The trains were sent across the river. There was a terrible storm of rain, turning to sleet and snow, and the roads were in such condition that Hood's army could make no more than 10 miles a day. The last of his forces, therefore, did not arrive in front of Columbia until the 26th. At Columbia, Schofield was joined by 1 brigade of infantry, and Wilson came forward from Nashville and took command of the cavalry, which had now been strengthened to 7,000 horsemen. Wilson placed his force along the north bank of the river to observe the enemy's movements either to the right or the left. As Thomas was anxious to preserve the railway bridge at Columbia for further use, he urged Schofield to hold his ground there. But Schofield became convinced that Hood intended to cross the river above the town and turn his position, so he withdrew his army to the north bank on the night of the 27th. The following night Forrest's cavalry forded the river; and early on the next morning, on the 29th, the corps of Cheatham and Stewart crossed by a pontoon bridge 3 miles above the town, and marched to Spring Hill on the Franklin Pike, 12 miles in Schofield's rear. Lee's corps was left behind, with orders to make a strong demonstration in front of the Union position. Information of these movements reached Schofield the morning of the 29th, and he immediately started Stanley for Spring Hill with 2 of his divisions, the trains, and reserve artillery. When Hood's force of about 18,000 men reached Spring Hill at 3 P.M., the place was held only by 1 Union division, 4,000 strong. Hood took Cheatham with Cleburne, 1 of his division commanders, within sight of the pike, along which the enemy could now be seen retreating at double quick, with wagons in a trot, and gave orders to attack at once and seize the pike. Similar orders were given to Stewart, and further commands were sent later by staff officers. But no attack was made, and the Confederate troops bivouacked within gunshot of the pike, without making any effort to occupy it. After nightfall, the Federal infantry all passed by, unmolested except for some random shots, to which they made no reply. This failure to destroy the Union army has never been satisfactorily explained. In his book, Hood calls the opportunity "the best move in my career as a soldier." Nevertheless, as General Alexander says, it proved the death blow to Hood's army. A single Confederate brigade, planted squarely across the pike, either north or south of Spring Hill, would have effectually prevented Schofield's retreat, and daylight would have found his whole force cut off from every avenue of escape by more than twice its numbers, to assault whom would have been madness, and to avoid whom would have been impossible. General Alexander states that Cheatham and Stewart were both absent from their troops that evening, and the former subsequently frankly admitted his delinquency. In view of the distinguished records of the two officers, Hood magnanimously overlooked their failure. Schofield had realized his dangerous position, and fully expected to find his route blocked, at least at Thompson's Station, 3 miles north of Spring Hill. He hoped that the corps of A. J. Smith might have reached Franklin, and dispatched one of his staff officers to hurry it forward. He also telegraphed General Thomas that he regarded his situation as extremely perilous. But he found the way clear, and his army reached Franklin without being seriously molested. The river was unfordable after the recent rains. The old wagon bridge was in bad condition, and the pontoon train had been destroyed at Columbia, to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Confederates. As soon as Schofield arrived, therefore, his first care was to repair the wagon bridge and plank the railway bridge. By noon this work was completed. In the meantime preparations were made to hold the south side of the river until the trains could be got across. The little town of Franklin was located on the southern bank of the Harpeth River, in a bend less than a mile across at its widest part. As fast as the troops came up, they entrenched a line upon rising ground, convex in shape, with both flanks resting upon the river, and completely covering the town. The two main highways left the town by the same street, but forked at the southern edge, the Columbia pike running south, and Carter's Creek pike southwest. Note: a map of Franklin can be found on page 390. The railway ran near the river, parallel to the road to Columbia. Just south of the town, and a quarter of a mile west of the river, the Carter House stood upon a low hill. To the east of the town, on the other side of the river, there was an earthwork, Fort Granger, where Federal batteries were placed, which commanded the open ground to the south and west. The entire line of entrenchments was about a mile and a half long. The space between the river and the Columbia pike, near the Carter House, was held by Cox's division. Ruger's division was between the two pikes; and Kimball's division carried the line to the river on the right. Wood was sent across to the north bank to protect the trains, and Wilson's cavalry was also on that side, to guard against any turning movement of the enemy. The Federal position was very strong, but it had one weak point which nearly proved fatal. On the arrival of Wagner's division of the Fourth Corps, which had served as rear guard, the First Brigade, Updike, took position within the lines, just west of the Columbia pike, as a reserve. But the two other brigades, Lane and Conrad, made a halt on a knoll 500 yards in front of the lines. They were not entrenched, as there was no intention to have them remain in this position. Wagner had been ordered to occupy the point, in observation, only till Hood should show a disposition to advance in force, and then to retire within the lines to Opdyke's position to act as a general reserve. The head of Hood's column arrived between 2 and 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 30th. Stewart's corps deployed to the east of the Columbia pike, and Cheatham's to the west, with Cleburne's division on the right, partly astride the pike, Brown's next, and Bates on the extreme left. Only Johnson's division of Lee's corps had come up, and it was held in reserve. The impetuous Hood, anxious to make up for the opportunity that he had lost the previous night, ordered Cheatham to attack at once. The two divisions of Cleburne and Brown, charging at double quick, fell like an avalanche upon Wagner's two brigades in their isolated position, and drove the men back in headlong flight. The Federal troops in the main line were obliged to withhold their fire in order to avoid killing their comrades, and the Confederates swept over the Union entrenchments on the heels of the fugitives. Over 1,000 prisoners were taken, and a wide rent was made in the very center of the Union line of battle. For a moment it looked as though the day were lost, but Opdycke hurried up his brigade from its position in reserve, and he was supported by 2 regiments of Cox's division. In the hand to hand struggle which ensued, the Confederates were finally driven out of the works. Just before nightfall, Johnson's division went to Cheatham's support, but the Union line held fast. Simultaneous attacks were made by Stuart on the right and Bate on the opposite flank, but no impression was made on the Federal lines. Though many of the Confederates succeeded in reaching the ditches, none crossed the parapets. Franklin was one of the most fiercely fought battles of the Civil War, and the Confederates "went down to defeat in a blaze of glory." Over 10% of the force engaged were killed on the field, over 20% were severely wounded, and as many more were slightly wounded or captured. Their loss of general officers was unparalleled on either side in any action of the war. 5 were killed, 5 were wounded, and 1 was captured. Of the regimental commanders, 53 were killed, wounded, or captured. Among the slain was Patrick Cleburne, the most brilliant Confederate division commander in the West. He began his military career as a corporal in the 31st Foot, and he himself attributed his rapid rise to the habits of efficiency he had acquired in the ranks of his old regiments in the British army. General Alexander attributes the Confederate failure to 3 causes. 1. Hood did not prepare his assault with any severe cannonade, because the village of Franklin was just in the rear of the Union line. 2. The action did not begin until 4 P.M. The sun set at 4:50, and there was no moon. Darkness therefore prevented Hood from getting in 2 of Lee's divisions. 3. The presence on the field of Casement's Federal brigade with magazine breech loaders, which did terrible execution. The battle continued with violence until 9 P.M., and firing was kept up until 3 A.M., when the Federals withdrew from the field, leaving their dead and wounded. During the night, the Union army continued its retreat to Nashville, taking with it the wagon trains, more than 1,000 prisoners, and 33 flags captured from the enemy. The forces of Schofield reached Nashville on the morning of the 1st of December, and took their place in the works. Wilson's cavalry, which had covered the flanks and rear of the retreating army, was sent to Edgefield on the north bank of the Cumberland. Hood followed, and arrived the next day. He immediately took position in front of the Union works, and threw up entrenchments. Lee's corps occupied the center of the line astride the road to Franklin; Cheatham's the right, and Stuart's the left. Most of the Confederate cavalry was stationed on the left, between Stuart and the river. Hood's army was now reduced to about 25,000 men, and he did not feel strong enough to assault the Union works. He hoped that Thomas would attack, and meet with a bloody repulse. By this time, A. J. Smith's veteran 16 Corps, 12,000 strong, had reached Nashville, and other reinforcements had brought Thomas's army up to about 55,000, including 12,000 cavalry. The Union works ran on a line of hills around Nashville, extending from the river above to the river below the city. Steedman's division was on the left; next, the 23rd Corps under Schofield; then the 4th Corps, now commanded by Wood, and Smith's troops on the right. Having finally assembled an army of good though rather mixed elements, Thomas did not propose to fight an indecisive battle like Shiloh or Gettysburg. He meant to make his victory a Waterloo, which should wipe the defeated army out of existence. He had a large force of cavalry, under a very able commander, and he intended to have it play an important part in the coming contest. He therefore proposed to give Wilson time to procure horses, to replace the large number worn out during the campaign. He also needed time to prepare his trains and pontoons for a vigorous pursuit after the battle. As usual, Mr. Stanton became impatient at once, and telegraphed General Grant that Thomas's course looked like the McClellan and Rosecrans strategy of doing nothing. With Grant's own large experience of unavoidable delays, one would suppose that he would have shown a better appreciation of the situation, but he began bombarding Thomas with despatch after despatch, in which he displayed unusual anxiety and some irritation. On the 6th, he ordered Thomas to "attack Hood at once." But in spite of this order Thomas decided to give Wilson 2 days more. On the 8th of December, Thomas was entirely ready. Then there came a storm of sleet and snow which covered the ground with a sheet of ice, and made any movement impossible for several days. At last, on the 14th, a warm rain cleared the ice away, and orders were issued for an attack the next day. In the meantime, Grant had prepared an order, which was never sent, appointing Schofield in place of Thomas; and on the 13th he directed Logan, who was still absent from his corps, to proceed to Nashville, and relieve Thomas. On the 15th Grant himself reached Washington on his way to Nashville. Note: A map showing the battlefield of Nashville can be found on page 395. Here he received news which satisfied him that neither he nor Logan was needed at Nashville. Nearly the entire space occupied by the Union army was enclosed by two small streams, Richland and Brown's Creeks, rising near each other in the high Brentwood hills, 4 or 5 miles south of Nashville, and flowing in divergent courses to the Cumberland. The Granny White Turnpike ran southward on the high ridge between the two creeks, and 8 other pikes radiated southward from the city. The ground was broken and hilly, with knolls and ridges rising 200 to 300 feet above the river; but it was mostly open, with timber here and there. Hood's main line, which was more than 5 miles long, stretched along a series of hills from the Chattanooga Railroad on the east to the Franklin Pike. Thence it crossed the valley of Brown's Creek, passed over the ridge on which ran the Granny White Pike, and reached a high knoll near the Hillsborough Pike, where it made a sharp turn to the south, following a stone wall along the pike for about 1,000 yards. In advance of the main line, a body of skirmishers was strongly posted on Montgomery Hill, at the Hillsborough Pike. Strong batteries were placed on 3 commanding points, and redoubts crowned 2 detached hills about a mile to the southwest, beyond a fork of Richland Creek. Hood's position was strong, but the line was too long to hold securely with his forces. The concave form was also an element of weakness. Thomas's plan of battle was for Smith and Wood, supported by Wilson's cavalry on their right flank, to make the main attack on Hood's left wing. At the same time, Steedman was to make a vigorous demonstration against Cheatham on the Confederate right. Schofield was to be kept in reserve. The movement began at dawn on the 15th of December. The early morning was foggy, but a hot sun burned off the mists before 9 o'clock. The mud resulting from the thaw made the operations very slow. Wood's corps marched by the right flank until its left rested on the salient at Lawrence Hill, which was the pivot upon which Wood and Smith were to wheel to the left. Smith formed on Wood's right, and Wilson's cavalry moved out to clear the Charlotte and Hardin pikes of the enemy on the right. Smith's corps and the cavalry advanced steadily, capturing the Confederate detached works one after another, until by noon they were well up to Hood's main line on the Hillsborough Pike. Wilson was then ordered to make a circuit to the right, with the view of gaining the Confederate rear, and Schofield was sent forward to take his place on Smith's right. In the meantime, at 8 o'clock, Steedman had advanced along the Murfreesboro Pike, and vigorously attacked Cheatham on the Confederate right. This demonstration not only occupied Cheatham all day, but it also neutralized Lee's corps and made it useless. Lee did not dare to send assistance either to Cheatham on his right or Stewart on his left, for fear that the Federals would charge straight down the Franklin Pike, and pierce the thin Confederate center. In the afternoon, Smith continued his advance against the Confederate left, and drove away the defenders behind the stone wall on the Hillsborough Pike. A division of the Fourth Corps had already taken the strong Confederate outpost position on Montgomery Hill, and Thomas now ordered Wood to carry the salient on the hill in front of his line. This was done in brilliant fashion, and the whole Confederate left was now shattered and falling back. The broken line did not rally until it had withdrawn behind the Granny White Pike. Here darkness ended the fighting. After nightfall, Hood formed a new line about 2 miles farther south, and entrenched it. He also changed the arrangement of his corps. Cheatham was moved over to the left flank, Stuart was placed in the centre, and Lee, who had taken little part in the action, was stationed on the right. The line, which was about 2 miles long, covered the two main roads to the south. The right rested on Overton Hill, just east of the Franklin Pike; the left, on 2 hills west of the Granny White Pike. The centre was on lower ground, which was broken by several branches of Brown's Creek. The cavalry under Chalmers was on the extreme left of the new line. Forrest's cavalry, except Chalmers' division, was absent during the battle. A detachment of some 8,000 Federals had been stationed at Murfreesboro to guard the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. On the 2d of December, Hood sent Bate's division, reinforced by 2 infantry brigades, to cooperate with Forrest in a raid against the railway and Rousseau's command at Murfreesboro. The expedition was successful in capturing a railway train and destroying several bridges and blockhouses, but Bate was defeated by Rousseau and then recalled. The absence of Forrest, as General Cox states, "made the opportunity which resulted so gloriously for our arms." On the morning of the 16th, the Federals advanced against the new Confederate line. The alignment was practically the same as on the previous day: Steedman on the extreme left; Wood next; then Smith and Schofield, with Wilson's cavalry on the extreme right. After a preliminary reconnaissance in force, to feel out the Confederate line, soon after noon Wood's corps, supported by Steedman's division, assaulted the right of the enemy's position, but was repulsed with severe loss. Meanwhile Wilson's cavalry had reached a position in the rear of the Confederate left. About 4 o'clock, Schofield and Smith attacked this part of the line in front and flank, while Wilson's dismounted troopers assailed it from the rear. Under the fire of artillery, which prevented the Confederates from raising their heads above the breastworks, the Federals made a sudden and gallant charge up to and over the intrenchments. The line thus pierced gave way, and soon afterward broke at all points. General Hood says, "I beheld for the first and only time a Confederate army abandon the field in confusion." All hope of rallying the troops proved vain. Wilson's dismounted men, when the break came, were widely separated from their horses. This delayed their pursuit, which was also impeded by a drenching rain which set in after nightfall. 2 miles from the battlefield, they found Chalmers' cavalry division strongly posted across the Granny White Pike behind a barricade of fence rails. This checked the Federal cavalry long enough to enable the fleeing Confederate infantry to pass the danger point, organize a rear guard, and make good their escape the next day. On the morning of the 17th, Smith and Schofield were ordered to follow Wilson along the Granny White Pike, while Wood's corps pursued the mass of the fugitives, who took the Franklin Pike. The cavalry caught up with Hood's rear guard 4 miles north of Franklin, and captured 400 prisoners. Forrest rejoined the army at Columbia, and covered the retreat to the Tennessee River. There the pursuit was abandoned. On the 10th of January, 1865, the remnant of the Confederate army was at Tupelo, Mississippi. 3 days later, Hood asked to be relieved from his command. It is difficult to give an exact statement of the numbers and losses during the Nashville campaign. At Franklin, Schofield had about 30,000 men of all arms; and at Nashville Thomas had some 55,000. The Union losses at Franklin are reported as 2,326, and at Nashville as 3,057, or less than 6,000 for the whole campaign. At the end of the Atlanta campaign, Hood had about 35,000 infantry, and he was joined at Tuscumbia by Forrest with perhaps 5,000 horsemen. He states that he lost 7,500 men at Franklin, and that his effective strength at Nashville was only 23,000. As he had sent Forrest with part of his cavalry, and Bate with his division, reinforced by 2 infantry brigades, or an expedition against Murfreesboro, this estimate is probably correct. Van Horne puts his losses at Franklin at 5,252, Livermore at 6,252, and Alexander at 7,550. Hood made no estimate of his losses at Nashville, except to state that they were "very small." Thomas reported 4,462 prisoners, and Hood puts his "missing" at about 4,500. At Tupelo, after the campaign, the Confederate army was reduced to about 18,000 men of all arms. At Nashville, the Confederate army in the West was virtually annihilated. It was the most decisive victory gained by either side during the Civil War, and one of the most brilliant. The campaign of Franklin and Nashville is one of the most interesting and instructive of the war. Hood's operations during the first month, from the time he left Lovejoy on the 20th of September, until he arrived at Gadsden, were bold in conception and brilliant in execution. He drew Sherman with his army all the way back to Resaca, 70 miles, and from there to Galesville, over 40 miles farther, and away from his line of communications. At this point, however, Sherman occupied a very strong strategic position, which left no course open to Hood except to cross the Tennessee at a point beyond Sherman's reach and move northward. This is precisely what Hood did. Major Steele thinks that General Thomas ought to have stopped Hood's army south of Duck River, and General Cox says that Thomas's right policy was to concentrate all his available forces promptly and meet Hood as near the Tennessee River as practicable. But with all deference to these authorities, it is doubtful whether the final outcome of the campaign would have been so decisive if Thomas had advanced from Nashville. Hood really lost the campaign through his stay of 3 weeks at Florence, while awaiting his supplies and the arrival of Forrest. This gave time for Sherman to transfer the Fourth and 23d Corps from Georgia to Tennessee; for Smith to bring the 16th Corps from Missouri; for Thomas to concentrate the scattered Federal detachments; and, finally, for Wilson to mount his cavalry. Up to about the 10th of November, Stanley's corps and a few regiments of cavalry were the only Union troops between Hood's army and Nashville. Hood's delay at Florence, however, came near turning out a strategic advantage for him, as it afforded an opportunity of outflanking Schofield at Pulaski. Later at Spring Hill, he failed to cut off and destroy the Union army only through the negligence of two of his corps commanders, which has never been satisfactorily explained. With victory almost in his grasp, like Hooker at Chancellorsville, Hood let the opportunity slip away. Although Cheatham was primarily to blame, Hood was on the ground and cannot shift the responsibility. After his failure at Franklin, Hood's advance to Nashville was a great mistake. It simply invited disaster. His final blunder was sending Forrest on a raid toward Murfreesboro. The absence of the bulk of the Confederate horsemen made possible the turning movement of the Federals which gained the victory on the second day. It was only one more instance of the general misuse of the cavalry during the Civil War. Although Thomas was very slow in getting ready to attack Hood, his final operations were nearly perfect in plan and execution. His cavalry did more actual fighting than was done on any other battlefield of the Civil War, but it fought dismounted. "Considering the disorder and rout in which Hood's beaten army quitted the battlefield," says Major Steele, "it might seem that they ought to have been cut off and blocked by Wilson's horsemen, 12,000 strong, and captured or destroyed by the pursuing infantry. But the earthen byroads over which the cavalry had to march were in such deplorable condition, the streams with their bridges destroyed were so high, and forage for animals was so scarce in the country, that Wilson, in spite of great exertion, was unable to check the fugitive column before it was safe across the Tennessee River." On the 2d of November, Sherman finally secured Grant's permission to undertake the "March to the Sea," on the understanding that Thomas was to be left strong enough to deal with Hood. Sherman began his preparations by burning every building in Atlanta. Not a single one was spared, not even a church. This was excused on the ground that "war is hell." As General Alexander tersely remarks, "It depends somewhat upon the warrior. The conduct of Lee's army in Pennsylvania presents a pleasing contrast." On the 15th Sherman started, taking with him 4 infantry corps, 63,000 strong, besides 5,000 cavalry under Kilpatrick. The wagon trains carried rations for 20 days, but he proposed to have his army live largely off the country. The Confederate authorities had hoped that the Georgia militia, aided by the few troops which could be gathered in the State, and by 13 brigades of cavalry under Wheeler, might impede the march, but such expectations proved vain. The march is notable mainly as an example of an army's cutting loose from its base and communications. The main purpose was to destroy the resources of the Confederacy, and this was done over a wide area. "There is no question," says General Alexander, "that the moral effect of this march upon the country at large, both at the North and at the South, and also upon foreign nations, was greater than would have been the most decided victory." The march through Georgia met with no serious opposition. On the 10th of December, Sherman was in front of the works about Savannah. On the 20th, Hardee evacuated the city, and withdrew to Charleston with the garrison of 18,000 men. On the 23d, Sherman occupied the place, and sent President Lincoln a telegram stating that he made Uncle Sam a Christmas present of the city, with 150 heavy guns, and 25,000 bales of cotton. From this point began the far more arduous march northward, toward the Carolinas. Fort Fisher was captured by General Terry about the middle of January, 1865, and toward the end of that month Sherman started by way of Columbia, South Carolina, to join General Grant in front of Petersburg. In February the Confederate Government made Lee general in chief, and he appointed Johnston to the command of such forces as could be assembled to oppose Sherman. Only about 30,000 men could be found to contend against the Union army of 90,000 veterans. There was an action at Averysboro on the 16th of March, and engagements from the 19th to the 21st at Bentonville. The Confederates were defeated at both places. Sherman then concentrated his army at Goldsboro for a further movement to the north. On the 14th of April, near Raleigh, North Carolina, General Sherman received from General Johnston a message requesting a cessation of hostilities with a view of negotiating terms of surrender. Arrangements were at once made for a personal interview on the 17th. As Sherman was starting for the meeting, he received a dispatch from Secretary Stanton, announcing the assassination of President Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theatre in Washington, on the night of Friday the 14th. After an interview with Johnston, another meeting was arranged for the following day, the 18th of April, when a conditional treaty was signed, subject to the ratification of President Johnson. The terms were not approved by the President, as they covered matters of a political nature, and on the 26th of April, General Johnston surrendered his army upon the same terms that General Lee had received. There was never the slightest justification for the criticism showered upon Sherman for his course in this matter. CHAPter XX.